You wake to darkness. It is always darkness now. In the depth of winter, the small window, a crude opening in the wall covered with oiled parchment that lets in a meager amount of light during the day, now shows only blackness. The rooster has not yet crowed. It might be the deep of night, or it might be approaching dawn. In winter, one bleeds into the other with little distinction. Your breath forms a cloud before your face. The fire has died down to embers again, as it does every night. The cold has crept in through every crack and crevice of your humble dwelling, settling into your bones like an unwelcome guest who refuses to leave. You can hear the soft breathing of your family around you, all huddled together on the straw mattress that rests directly on the packed earth floor. Rising quietly, careful not to disturb the others who need their rest, you make your way to the hearth. The central fire pit of your single-room home contains only a faint orange glow. You kneel beside it, your knees pressing into the hard-packed dirt floor. With practiced hands, you reach for the small pile of kindling kept nearby, twigs and small branches you and your children spent hours gathering from the edge of the Lord's forest yesterday. You dare not venture too deep. The penalties for poaching wood from the Lord's lands are severe. You arrange the kindling carefully over the embers. Every piece matters. Every twig represents time spent gathering, time not spent at other necessary tasks. The fire must be coaxed back to life with care and patience. Too much wood at once and precious fuel is wasted. Too little, and the embers will die completely. Slowly you blow on the embers. Your breath, the same breath that forms clouds in the frigid air, now serves a purpose. It feeds the dying fire. You blow again, gently, steadily. The embers glow brighter in response. A small flame appears, tentative at first, then growing as it catches the dry kindling. You feed it carefully, adding slightly larger pieces only when you're certain they will catch. The small flame casts dancing shadows on the walls of your home. The thatch roof above, blackened by years of smoke, seems to hang lower in winter, as if the weight of occasional snow and constant dampness presses it down toward the inhabitants below. You notice a spot where the thatch has thinned. Another task for spring. If you make it there, the light reveals your home in its winter state. The walls, made of wattle and daub, thin branches woven together and covered with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung, provide some barrier against the wind, but they are far from perfect. In places, you can feel drafts seeping through. Each year you patch these walls, but each winter new cracks appear, as if winter itself is determined to find a way in. Along one wall sits a rough wooden bench and table, where your family takes meals when there is food enough to merit sitting. A few crude tools hang from pegs. A knife with a worn handle, a wooden spoon blackened from use, a small iron pot that was your mother's before you. In the corner rests a pile of straw covered with a rough woolen cloth, bedding for the goat that normally shares your home in the harshest months, providing both milk and warmth. The goat is thin this year, her milk decreasing daily, but her body heat is still a blessing. The fire grows just enough to illuminate your sleeping family, your spouse face lined with the same worry that you carry, even in sleep. Your children, 3 of them that survived beyond infancy, curled together beneath the shared coverings, a collection of rough woolen blankets and cloaks that serve as both daytime wear and nighttime warmth. 5 winters ago, there were 6 of you huddled together. You pushed the memory away. Winter takes its toll, and dwelling on losses only makes the cold bite deeper. The fire now established, you reach for the bundle hanging from a ceiling beam above the hearth. Dried herbs, those you managed to save from your small garden plot, dangle in small bunches. You select a few sprigs of dried rosemary. It will add little flavor to the morning pottage, but the ritual of adding something, anything matters. It creates the illusion of plenty, or at least of not complete deprivation. The iron pot is placed carefully near the flames. You add water from the covered bucket in the corner, water that your oldest child hauled from the village well yesterday, breaking through the thin crust of ice that had formed overnight. Into the water goes a handful of dried peas that have soaked overnight, along with a few withered vegetables from your root cellar, a small underground pit beneath the packed earth floor, accessed by moving a heavy stone. The cellar holds what remains of your harvest, wrinkled turnips, a few carrots, onions that have begun to sprout despite the cold. You choose the smallest turnip, saving the larger ones for harder days that you know will come. As you prepare this meager breakfast, you are acutely aware of how the pile in the root cellar has diminished since Michaelmas in late September. It is now deep in January, And February still looms ahead, the hunger month, as the old ones call it. March can be just as brutal, with stored food all but gone and new growth not yet available. You have rationed carefully, but there is always the fear that it will not be enough. The fire requires constant attention. Unlike the grand fireplaces in the Lord's manor, your humble hearth offers little in the way of heat retention. The smoke rises toward the hole in the roof, much of it lingering inside before finding its way out. This smoky atmosphere helps preserve the limited food hanging from the rafters. A few bundles of herbs, perhaps some dried fish if the year was good, strings of onions and garlic, but it also irritates eyes and lungs. The persistent cough that most villagers develop by midwinter is as much from smoke as from cold. Your eldest child stirs, coughing slightly before rising to join you by the fire. At 12 winters, she is already well versed in the rituals of survival. Without being asked, she reaches for the small basket of dried dung, a mixture from your goat and the communal ox that serves the entire village. This precious fuel, collected and dried during warmer months, burns slowly and with less heat than wood, but it extends your meager supply of proper firewood. The north corner is coldest, she whispers, not wanting to wake the younger ones just yet. Let them have a few more moments of sleep, where hunger and cold cannot reach them. You nod, knowing without checking that she is right. The north wall, most exposed to the biting winds that sweep down from the distant mountains, always surrenders first to winter's assault. Tonight, you will rearrange the sleeping area, moving the youngest away from that vulnerable corner. The pottage begins to simmer, releasing a subtle aroma that is more promise than fulfillment. Your daughter takes over stirring while you move to check on your most precious winter possession, the small store of rye flour kept in a wooden box raised slightly off the ground to protect it from rodents. The box has a tight-fitting lid, sealed with beeswax around the edges when you could get it. Carefully opening the lid, you assess what remains, perhaps enough for 6 more loaves before spring. 6 loaves to stretch across 6 or 7 weeks. It will not be enough. You take just a small handful of the flour, closing the lid quickly, as if the contents might somehow escape if exposed too long to the air. This scant amount will be added to the pottage to thicken it, creating the illusion of substance where little exists. Outside, the first uncertain light of dawn begins to filter through the oiled parchment window. Another day of winter survival has officially begun. The rooster crows at last, though even his call seems muted by the cold. Your spouse wakes now, rising stiffly from the shared bed. Like you, they know without discussion what tasks await. While you tend to the breakfast, they check the roof, where a leak had begun to form days earlier. A temporary patch of mud and straw might hold until a proper repair can be made in spring. If the thatch gives way completely, your family might need to seek shelter with neighbors, crowding into their equally small dwelling until repairs can be made. The sharing of space is common in winter. More bodies mean more heat. Sometimes multiple families will gather in one home, taking turns keeping the fire fed through the longest nights. The closeness brings complications. Illness spreads more quickly. Privacy becomes a distant memory. Tensions rise as resources diminish, but the shared warmth often means survival. Your youngest, barely 5 winters old, wakes crying from the cold. Your middle child, 8 years of surviving winter, automatically pulls the little one closer, sharing body heat before either is fully awake. These instincts of preservation are learned early. The pottage is ready now, steam rising from the pot. Your daughter has added the precious pinch of flour and a few crumbles of dried herbs. The family gathers around, each with a wooden bowl worn smooth from years of use. As the eldest, you serve the others first, largest portion to your spouse who must chop wood today, then to the children from oldest to youngest, with you taking what remains. This morning what remains is little more than broth with a few fragments of vegetable floating in it, but it is hot, and that counts for much in winter. The meal is consumed mostly in silence. Speaking requires energy, and energy is precisely what you are all trying to conserve. The fire, carefully tended, provides just enough light to see by, and just enough heat to take the sharpest edge off the cold. It never feels adequate. It never has. After the modest breakfast, the day's task must begin regardless of the cold. Your spouse takes the axe, a precious metal tool passed down through generations, and prepares to venture to the designated area where villagers are permitted to gather firewood. The manor's steward has marked certain trees that have fallen naturally or been deemed expendable. Taking wood from any others would result in heavy fines, or worse, your eldest will accompany them, helping to carry back whatever they can gather. Before they leave, Both dress in layers, linen undergarments covered by woolen tunics. Then whatever cloaks or mantles can be spared, their feet are wrapped in rags before being pushed into leather shoes that have been patched repeatedly. The leather is stiff from the cold and both wince slightly as they force their feet inside. Be back before midday, you say, though all of you know this is unnecessary advice. No one stays out longer than needed in such weather. The sky looks heavy. Your spouse nods, glancing up at the small window. The quality of light suggests snow may be coming. More snow means more difficulty gathering wood, more energy expended keeping paths clear, more dampness seeping into the home. But it also means insulation, if it piles against the walls, and water when it melts. Winter offers no simple blessings or curses. Everything is double-edged. As they depart, you turn your attention to the fire again. It needs constant tending, constant feeding. Too much fuel at once wastes precious resources. Too little, and the fire dies. This balance, this perpetual precarious balance, is the central rhythm of winter survival. Your middle child takes on the task of checking the small stores of preserved food hanging from the rafters. Bundles of dried herbs, a few strips of dried meat saved from the autumn slaughtering, onions on strings. The careful accounting of food becomes a daily ritual in winter. Each day, decisions must be made about what can be used and what must be saved. The youngest child is given the simplest but still valuable task of collecting the previous day's ashes from the fire pit. Once cooled, these ashes have multiple uses: mixed with fat for soap, scattered on ice to prevent falling, saved for spring to enrich the soil in your garden plot. Nothing is wasted. Nothing can be. You yourself begin the task of mending. By the weak light of day supplemented by the fire's glow, you repair a tear in your spouse's tunic, using a bone needle and thread made from flax grown in your own small plot. The fabric is worn thin in places, the thread passing through with minimal resistance. This garment has been mended so many times that in some areas, the repairs outnumber the original material. As you work, you keep one eye on the fire. It consumes its fuel steadily, the small flames dancing but never really growing strong enough to truly warm the space. The smoke rises in thin tendrils, much of it finding the roof hole, but enough lingering to sting your eyes and catch in your throat occasionally. The day passes in these small, essential tasks. The youngest child coughs more frequently as the day progresses, a dry, rasping sound that you note with concern, but try not to dwell on. Winter coughs are common. Most pass with time. Some do not. You add a bit more of the dried herbs to the fire when the child isn't looking, hoping the aromatic smoke might ease the irritation in small lungs. Midday approaches, and with it, a noticeable darkening outside. Snow is coming, as you predicted. You peer anxiously out the small window, looking for signs of your spouse, and eldest returning from their wood-gathering expedition. The path leading to your dwelling remains empty. The wind picks up, its moan audible through the walls. It finds every crack, every seam in your modest home, sending small, probing fingers of cold air inside. The fire flickers in response to these drafts. Your middle child automatically moves closer to the youngest, both of them edging nearer to the hearth. When the door finally opens, it brings a swirl of snowflakes, and your spouse and eldest, their arms laden with wood. Not as much as you had hoped for, but more than you had feared. Their faces are red from cold, their breath coming in visible puffs. The steward was watching, your spouse explains, setting down their burden carefully near the fire. Could not take more than what he deemed appropriate. The wood is not ideal. Some pieces are still partially green, not having had proper time to season. Green wood burns poorly, producing more smoke than heat, but it is fuel, and for that, you are grateful. Your eldest shakes snow from her cloak before hanging it on a peg near the fire, where it might dry somewhat before being needed again. The miller's son has a cough that worsens, she reports quietly. His mother traded me this for some of our dried rosemary. She produces a small bundle from inside her tunic, a precious handful of rye flour, likely more than they could truly spare. This exchange of resources, this community sharing that happens below the notice of lord or steward, is another key to winter survival. The official systems of manor life make no allowances for the particular cruelties of winter. It is in these small unofficial networks of support that hope resides. The snow falls more heavily now. Through the window, the world has turned white and indistinct. The wind drives the snow horizontally at times, creating small drifts against the north wall outside. Inside, you all move in the practiced choreography of confinement. The space, small to begin with, seems to shrink as winter progresses, and more activities must take place indoors. The afternoon meal is similar to breakfast, pottage again, though this time with a bit of the dried meat added for strength. The snow means your spouse and eldest cannot make another trip for wood today. What you have must last through the night and possibly tomorrow, depending on how long the storm continues. As daylight fades, too early, always too early in winter, the family gathers closer to the fire. This is the time for tasks that require less light. Spinning thread using a drop spindle, carving small wooden objects with a knife, telling stories that have been passed down through generations. Stories of spring, of harvests, of times when the world was not constrained by cold and scarcity. The fire never burns bright enough. This is the central truth of winter existence. No matter how carefully tended, how precisely fed, it cannot fully push back the cold that waits just beyond its reach. The flames dance, casting long shadows across the walls, creating the illusion of movement and life where stillness predominates. Night falls completely. Outside, the snow continues to fall, accumulating against the walls and on the roof. The weight of it is both concerning and comforting. Too much could damage the thatch, but the layer of white also insulates, trapping what little heat escapes from inside. For supper, you serve the last of the day's pottage, now thick from sitting near the fire all afternoon. Each portion is small, but the broth has developed a deeper flavor from the long, slow cooking. To supplement this meager offering, you slice the day-old bread into thin pieces, one for each family member. The bread is dense and dark, made primarily from rye flour with ground acorns added to extend the precious grain. Chewing requires effort. The bread is tough and not particularly flavorful, but it fills the belly in a way that broth alone cannot. No one complains. Complaints about food are rare in winter. To voice dissatisfaction with what is available seems to tempt an even greater scarcity. After the meal, preparations for night begin. The fire is banked carefully, covered partially with ashes, to slow its consumption of fuel while maintaining enough heat to rekindle in the morning. Extra layers are added to the sleeping area. Straw freshened where possible, every available piece of fabric arranged for maximum warmth. The family retires together, huddled close on the shared mattress. The youngest is placed in the center, where the coldest drafts cannot reach. The eldest takes the spot nearest the north wall, having quietly insisted on this position despite your objections. At 12, she already understands sacrifice. Sleep comes fitfully. The fire's diminished light creates strange, shifting shadows. The wind finds new voices as it wraps around the dwelling. The occasional cough, your youngest, then your middle child, then yourself, punctuates the darkness. Through the night, you wait periodically to check the fire, adding the smallest possible amount of fuel to maintain its essential presence. Each time you survey your sleeping family, counting breaths, assessing the quality of rest. This too is survival. This constant semi-conscious vigilance. Dawn arrives gray and muffled. The snow has stopped, but a thick blanket of white now surrounds the dwelling. Your spouse rises first, moving stiffly to the fire to begin the day's first rekindling. The cycle begins again. And so it goes, day after day. The fire that is the center of your existence never truly provides enough warmth, enough light, enough security. Yet you tend it faithfully, understanding that this imperfect comfort is all that stands between your family and the cold that waits patiently outside. The cold that has taken others in winters past and will take more before spring finally returns. The fire flickers, the shadows dance, but it never really lasts. Nothing in winter does, except winter itself. Hunger arrives slowly, then all at once, like a familiar stranger who visits each winter. It makes itself known first in small ways. A hollow feeling that the morning pottage doesn't quite fill, a lightheadedness when you stand too quickly, a preoccupation with food that becomes constant rather than occasional. Then suddenly, it seems hunger is all there is. A presence that fills the small dwelling more completely than any person could, more persistently than the cold itself. By February, the hunger month, as generations before you have called it, the carefully rationed stores from autumn have dwindled to concerning levels. The root cellar, accessed through the heavy stone in the floor, now contains only the saddest specimens, sprouting onions with withered bodies, carrots grown soft and flexible, turnips developing spots of mold that must be cut away before the remaining flesh can be used. Each retrieval from this diminishing supply requires careful consideration. Take too much now, and March will be unbearable. Take too little, and strength needed for daily tasks will fail. You kneel on the packed earth floor, the stone cover of the root cellar moved aside, and peer into the shallow pit. Your eldest daughter crouches beside you, holding a small tallow candle that provides just enough light to assess what remains. The candle itself is a precious thing, rendered from fat saved during the autumn slaughtering and reserved for only the most necessary illumination. The turnips won't last another week, she observes quietly, her voice neutral. At 12, she has already experienced enough winters to understand the gravity of the situation without requiring explicit explanation. You nod, reaching down to select a turnip that shows the least decay. We'll use half today, half tomorrow. You decide. The small carrots can stretch through next week if we're careful. The unspoken question hangs between you, and then what? Neither of you gives it voice. Giving voice to the fear seems dangerous, as if speaking of worst outcomes might summon them. Your daughter holds the candle steady as you make your selections for the day. Half a turnip, one small onion, a handful of dried peas that have been soaking since yesterday. These humble ingredients will become breakfast for 5 people, with perhaps enough left for a meager supper. The midday meal, when everyone is engaged in necessary tasks, will be nothing more than a piece of the increasingly hard bread and perhaps some snow melted with a few herbs for a tea that offers more comfort than nutrition. As you arrange these items in a small wooden bowl, your middle child appears at your side, face still creased from sleep. At 8 years old, he has already developed the hollow-cheeked look of winter. His eyes seem larger than they did in autumn, his wrists more pronounced when his sleeves pull back. I dreamed of cheese, he says simply, helping you replace the heavy stone over the root cellar. Yellow cheese like we had at Harvest Feast. You smooth his hair, noting how it has lost some of its luster as winter progressed. Perhaps we'll have cheese again when the goat has her kid, you offer, though both of you know this is far from certain. The goat, thin herself despite receiving a share of your limited stores, may not produce enough milk for both her offspring and your family. Many difficult decisions lie ahead. At the hearth, your spouse has already rekindled the fire and hung the iron pot in position. The youngest child, just 5, sits wrapped in a blanket nearby, watching the flames with unusual stillness. The persistent cough that troubled them days earlier seems somewhat improved this morning, a small mercy in a season that offers few. You bring the day's ingredients to the fire, placing them beside the pot where water already warms. With practiced efficiency, you begin the preparation. The turnip half scraped and cut into small pieces to create the illusion of abundance. The onion minced finely, so its flavor will permeate throughout. The soaked peas added whole. To this humble mixture, you add a pinch of dried herbs from the bundles hanging overhead. Thyme today, its earthy scent, a reminder of the garden that now lies dormant beneath snow and frozen soil. I'll check the snares, your spouse says, reaching for the heavy woolen cloak hanging by the door. The snares, simple traps set where rabbits and other small game might travel, rarely yield much in deepest winter. Animals too become scarce as food diminishes. But the possibility of meat, of protein and fat that might sustain you through the coming weeks, merits the expenditure of energy required to check them. While the pottage simmers, filling the small dwelling with a scent that is more promise than fulfillment, you turn your attention to the dwindling supply of flour. The wooden box that holds this precious resource sits elevated on stones in the driest corner of the home. When you lift the lid, you're met with a disheartening sight, barely enough rye flour to make 2 more loaves. 2 loaves to stretch across potentially 6 more weeks of winter. You close the lid quickly, as if doing so might somehow preserve the contents. Your eldest daughter, observing this assessment, speaks in a low voice so the younger children won't hear. We could try the bark bread again. Toe bark bread. A desperate measure made by grinding the inner bark of certain trees and mixing it with what little flour remains, is bitter and offers minimal nutrition, but it creates bulk that fills the stomach temporarily. You made this substitute during the terrible winter 3 years ago, when snow fell so heavily that it collapsed a section of the thatch and buried the woodpile. When the youngest was just a fragile infant who didn't survive until spring. Not yet, you decide, but gather some bark when you collect kindling today. We'll dry it by the fire to have ready. The pottage is ready now, having simmered just long enough for the vegetables to soften and the flavors to meld as much as they can. You ladle the thin mixture into the family's wooden bowls, carefully ensuring that each portion contains some of the solid pieces along with the broth. As always, your spouse receives the largest share. the children next according to their ages and needs, with you taking the remainder. The remainder today is mostly broth with a few fragments of turnip. You sip it slowly, making the warmth and minimal sustenance last as long as possible. Across from you, you notice your middle child trying to do the same with his slightly more substantial portion, taking small spoonfuls and chewing each piece of vegetable thoroughly before swallowing. He has learned the winter lessons well. Your spouse returns from checking the snares, bringing with him a blast of cold air and disappointing news. Nothing today, they report, hanging the cloak back on its peg. The garment is damp from snow, and you make a mental note to position it near enough to the fire to dry but not so close that the precious wool might scorch. The morning meal concluded. The day's necessary tasks begin. Your spouse takes the axe and departs again, this time to the designated area where the manor's steward permits the gathering of fallen wood. Your eldest daughter accompanies them, as much for the extra hands to carry wood, as for the safety of having someone else present in case of accident or overexertion. You remain at the dwelling with the two younger children, assigning tasks that match their abilities and the day's needs. The middle child is sent to collect snow in the wooden bucket. Clean snow from the top layer, untouched by animals or contamination. This will be melted for washing and cooking, preserving the water from the well for drinking. The youngest helps you sweep the packed earth floor with a crude broom made from bound twigs. This daily maintenance helps control the debris that 5 people living in close quarters inevitably create. The activity also generates modest warmth through movement, a small but welcome benefit. As these tasks are completed, your attention returns constantly to the fire. It must be fed regularly but conservatively. Each piece of precious fuel must deliver maximum benefit before another is added. The smoke rising toward the hole in the thatch roof carries away some of the heat, an unavoidable inefficiency of your humble hearth. By midday, hunger has reasserted itself. The morning pottage, meager as it was, has been fully metabolized, leaving behind that familiar hollow feeling. You distribute the day's allotment of bread, thin slices from the loaf made 3 days earlier, now hard enough that they must be softened in a few drops of water before they can be properly chewed. Your middle child receives his portion and examines it briefly before asking, "Tomorrow, could mine be a bit smaller and his a bit larger?" He nods toward the youngest, who has been quieter than usual today. The generous impulse brings a brief warmth that has nothing to do with the fire. "We'll see," you reply, not committing to the redistribution, but acknowledging the offer. The afternoon brings your spouse and eldest daughter back to the dwelling, their arms laden with wood, less than you had hoped for, but more than you had feared. This seems to be the constant state of winter, outcomes that fall somewhere between worst fears and modest hopes. Never quite enough, but somehow just sufficient to continue. Along with the wood, they bring news from the village proper, where they encountered other families engaged in similar gathering activities. The miller's wife says the Lord Steward will distribute a portion of the winter stores from the manor granary next week. Your spouse reports, carefully arranging the collected wood near the hearth to dry, a measure of rye for each household. This news brings both relief and skepticism. Similar promises have been made in previous winters, sometimes fulfilled generously, sometimes partially, occasionally not at all. The Lord's obligation to prevent outright starvation among his tenants is recognized but interpreted with varying degrees of commitment. The miller's youngest has the cough still. Your eldest adds, unwrapping her outer layers and moving toward the fire to warm her hands. Worse than before. They've tried the honey and herb syrup, but honey is scarce. You nod, grateful that your own youngest seems to be recovering from the similar cough that had caused concern days earlier. Honey, a precious substance used sparingly for both food and medicine, was depleted from your own stores by Epiphany. Its absence limits your options for treating winter ailments. The afternoon passes in indoor tasks. Your spouse repairs a tear in the leather shoe belonging to your middle child, using thin strips cut from an old belt to create makeshift laces. Your eldest daughter spins thread from the small store of wool saved from last shearing. You sort through the remaining dried herbs hanging from the rafters, combining similar bundles to create space for the spring harvest that seem impossibly distant now. The younger children entertain themselves quietly in the corner, using small carved wooden figures to enact elaborate scenarios involving harvests and feasts, dreams of abundance played out in miniature while scarcity surrounds them. As daylight begins to fade, too early, always too early in winter, you prepare the evening meal. The remainder of the morning's pottage forms the base, reheated and extended with the addition of water and the last small onion from the root cellar. To this thin mixture, you add something saved for this specific moment. The bones from the rabbit caught in a snare 4 days earlier. These bones, already simmered once to extract much of their nourishment, have been kept wrapped in a cloth near the door where the cold preserves them from spoiling. Now cracked with the back of a knife to expose the marrow. They are added to the pot to impart what little flavor and nutrition they still contain. The bone broth pottage, as it simmers over the fire, releases an aroma that awakens hunger even more intensely than before. Your middle child pauses in his activities, nose tilting upward like an animal catching a promising scent. The youngest moves closer to the hearth, blankets still wrapped around small shoulders. When will it be ready? They ask, voice quiet but edged with eagerness. Soon, you promise. Come, help me prepare while we wait. You guide the children in the ritual of readying for the meal. Wooden bowls wiped clean with a cloth, spoons arranged, the small bench pulled near the fire so everyone can eat in relative warmth. These preparations serve a dual purpose, creating useful occupation to distract from hunger and involving the children in the process of nourishment, however modest it may be. When the bone broth pottage is finally ready, the family gathers in their accustomed places. Steam rises from the bowls as you ladle the thin liquid, making sure each portion contains some of the tiny bits of vegetable and barely visible specks of marrow that represent the meal's substance. The bone broth speaks directly to something primal within each of you. The body recognizes the nourishment it offers, modest though it is. For a brief time as you sip the warm liquid, the constant companion of hunger recedes slightly, moves from the center of consciousness to its periphery. But this respite is temporary. By the time you settle onto the shared sleeping pallet for the night, hunger has returned to take up residence in your awareness. It speaks in the hollow feeling beneath your ribs, in the slight tremor of your hands as you bank the fire for the night, in the dreams that come when sleep finally arrives. You dream of bread, not the dense gray bread of winter desperation, but the lighter loaves of harvest time, when grain is relatively plentiful, and the addition of restricted ingredients might include an egg or a bit of honey. In the dream, the bread steam rises from the broken crust, carrying an aroma that seems to fill the whole world with possibility. You wake before dawn with the phantom scent of dream bread, still in your nostrils, and the reality of hunger already present. Beside you, your family sleeps in the huddled configuration that conserves warmth, bodies pressed together, the youngest in the center, blankets and cloaks layered over all. Your spouse's breathing has the slightly labored quality it develops each winter, a subtle wheeze that appears with the persistent damp and smoke. Rising carefully to avoid waking the others, you move to the hearth where last night's banked fire still holds a faint orange glow beneath the protective layer of ashes. This morning, like every morning, begins with the resurrection of this essential flame. You add the smallest pieces of kindling, disturbing the ashes as little as possible to maintain what heat remains while encouraging new combustion. As you blow gently on the embers, coaxing them back to active life, your stomach cramps with a sharp pain that has become familiar. It's the pain of prolonged hunger, not the acute agony of sudden starvation, but the chronic, grinding discomfort of never having quite enough. Your body has learned to expect this feeling, has adapted to its presence just as it has adapted to the perpetual chill. The kindling catches, small flames appearing to cast weak light across the darkened dwelling. In this half-light, you check the stores that remain. The daily accounting has become ritualistic, almost devotional, a practice that provides structure when so much else feels uncertain. The flour box contains enough for perhaps one more loaf. The root cellar holds 3 small carrots, 1 turnip heavily spotted with mold, and a handful of wizened onions. The bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters have thinned dramatically since autumn. The smoked meat that once hung there is long gone, consumed in careful portions that stretched through early winter but could not last until spring. Today marks the beginning of February's second week. The old ones always said that these middle weeks of February were when winter claimed its dues. When hunger became a presence so solid, it might as well take a seat at the hearth. Your eldest daughter wakes and joins you silently by the fire, her movements as careful as yours to allow the others a few more precious moments of sleep. The only time when hunger recedes completely. I had a dream about cheese, she whispers, echoing the words your middle child had spoken days earlier. You nod, understanding. The hunger dreams have started. It's not uncommon in these leanest weeks, these dreams of food, vivid and detailed. Sometimes you wake with the taste of summer berries still on your tongue, or the phantom sensation of chewing bread made from new wheat, only to open your eyes to the reality of continued scarcity. Together, you and your daughter prepare the day's first meal. Water in the pot, the last of the soaked dried peas, one small carrot cut into the thinnest possible slices, an onion chopped so finely it seems to dissolve into the liquid. To stretch this meager offering, you add pine needles gathered yesterday, not for their minimal flavor which tends toward resinous bitterness, but for the chewing texture they provide and the trace vitamins they contain. The rest of the family wakes as the smell of the simmering mixture fills the dwelling. It's not an enticing aroma, nothing like the robust sense of autumn cooking, but it signals that some form of nourishment will soon be available. And in winter, that alone is enough to create anticipation. Your spouse coughs several times before speaking. "I'll check the snares again," they say, voice rough from sleep and the persistent irritation of smoke. "Then see if there's work at the mill." The miller mentioned needing help with repairs to the water wheel. Work at the mill might mean payment in flour or grain, precious commodities that could significantly extend your dwindling supplies. But it also requires strength that prolonged hunger has begun to compromise. You notice how your spouse's wrists have grown more pronounced, how the belt that secures their tunic has been tightened another notch since midwinter. The morning pottage is distributed in the usual order, largest portion to your working spouse, then decreasing amounts by age and need, with you taking what remains. This morning, what remains is little more than hot water with the memory of vegetables. You drink it slowly, allowing the warmth to spread through your body, creating at least the sensation of sustenance where little exists. Your middle child finishes his portion quickly, then stares into the empty bowl as if willing more to appear. He doesn't complain complaints about food are rare in winter, but the lingering look at the empty vessel speaks volumes. "We'll try the snares again today," you reassure him, "and gather bark for bread." The mention of bark bread causes your eldest to exchange a glance with you. She remembers the last time such measures were necessary, remembers the bitter taste and minimal satisfaction such bread provided, but she nods encouragingly to her brother. "The taste isn't so bad if we mix it with the last of the dried berries." This small kindness, this attempt to make the coming deprivation seem less daunting, brings a tightness to your throat. Children should not have to become so adept at the mechanics of near starvation, yet they do, winter after winter, developing skills and knowledge that will serve them throughout lives likely to contain similar periods of scarcity. After the morning meal, such as it was, the family disperses to their tasks. Your spouse checks the snares before heading toward the mill to seek work. Your eldest takes the middle child to gather bark and whatever kindling can be found under the snow. You remain at the dwelling with the youngest, whose cough has returned slightly with the morning's chill. The day stretches before you, filled with the small, essential tasks of survival. You scrape the last flecks of precious fat from the container where it has been stored since the autumn slaughtering. This rendered fat, tallow from sheep and lard from the shared pig your family co-owned with neighbors, has been rationed carefully for cooking and occasional candle making. Now, as it nears depletion, each tiny amount becomes increasingly valuable. The scraped fat goes into a small clay cup with dried herbs and snow melted by the fire. This mixture, warmed slightly, becomes a salve for the youngest child's chapped lips and raw nostrils, sore from the persistent cold and repeated wiping. As you apply this homemade remedy, you notice how the child's face has changed since autumn. The roundness of early childhood has diminished, cheekbones becoming more pronounced, eyes seeming larger in the thinner face. Winter transforms everyone in this way, but its effects on the youngest always seem most stark, most concerning. "Tell me about spring," the child requests, voice slightly muffled as you apply the salve. This too is a winter ritual. These requests for stories about warmer seasons, about times of greater abundance. The telling serves as both education and comfort. A reminder that the current deprivation is not permanent, that the world will eventually return to a state of greater generosity. In spring, you begin, your hands continuing their gentle work. The earth wakes up from its winter sleep. First come the tiny green shoots pushing through the last of the snow, snowdrops so small you must look carefully to find them. Then the crocuses with their purple and yellow faces turned up to catch the strengthening sun. The child listens intently, eyes closed now as much from enjoyment of the story as from the soothing effect of the salve. The birds return bringing their songs back to the woods. The streams run full with melted snow, and the first tender greens appear in the protected places where the earth warms first. You continue the description, painting a picture of the awakening land, the first wild foods that can be gathered, nettles and dandelion greens, the early roots that supplement dwindling winter stores. You speak of the manor's fields being plowed for the first planting, of lambs being born in the communal flock, of the goat's milk flowing more abundantly, as fresh growth provides better forage. And will there be bread? The child asks, opening eyes that now show a gleam of anticipation despite the present hunger. Yes, there will be bread, you promise. Not right away, for the grain must grow and ripen and be harvested. But there will be other foods before then, eggs as the chickens respond to longer days, milk from the goat, the first garden vegetables. And eventually, yes, there will be bread again. This promise, though distant in fulfillment, provides comfort. The reassurance that hunger, like winter itself, will eventually end offers a framework for enduring current deprivation. The morning passes in similar small tasks and conversations. You check the thatch for leaks caused by melting snow, reinforce a weak spot in the wattle and daub wall, sort through the remaining stores one more time in case something edible has been overlooked. Throughout these activities, hunger remains a constant presence, a physical sensation that occasionally sharpens into pain before subsiding again to a dull, persistent ache. Your spouse returns at midday, bringing news rather than food. The miller has work tomorrow, repairs to the water wheel mechanism. Payment will be a measure of rye flour. The prospect of flour, of the bread it will eventually become, brightens the dim interior of the dwelling more effectively than any reinforcement to the window covering could achieve. But tomorrow's potential bounty doesn't address today's needs. Hunger continues its quiet conversation with your body, speaking through lightheadedness when you stand too quickly, through the persistent gnawing beneath your ribs, through the slight tremor in your hands as you stoke the fire. For the midday meal, you serve only herbs steeped in hot water, a tea that provides flavor and minimal nutrition, but more importantly, fills the stomach temporarily with warm liquid. Your spouse and eldest daughter receive a small piece of the remaining bread with their tea. The younger children and you go without this supplementation, preserving what little remains for those expending the most energy on survival tasks. After this modest refreshment, your eldest daughter and middle child return to their gathering expedition. This time they bring back not only kindling and strips of inner bark from selected trees, but also a small prize, winter mushrooms discovered growing on a fallen log partially protected from snow by overhanging branches. These mushrooms, small, tough specimens, nothing like the plump varieties that appear after autumn rains, represent an unexpected addition to the day's resources. You examine them carefully, comparing their appearance to the knowledge passed down through generations about which fungi are safe and which bring sickness or worse. Satisfied that these particular mushrooms are among the edible varieties, you clean them meticulously. They will add both substance and flavor to the evening meal. A small victory against scarcity. The afternoon brings another visitor to your dwelling, an elderly neighbor whose own small home stands a short distance away. Her arrival is preceded by a dry cough that serves as both announcement and warning, giving you time to prepare for the opening door and accompanying draft of cold air. Good wife, she greets you, using the formal address despite years of familiarity. In her gnarled hands, she carries a small cloth bundle. I've brought nettle seeds saved from summer for your tea. This offering, these carefully gathered and preserved seeds that provide trace nutrition when steeped in hot water, represents significant generosity in a season defined by scarcity. The old woman has survived more winters than anyone else in the settlement, her knowledge and careful management of resources enabling her continued existence despite increasing frailty. You honor us. You respond, accepting the bundle with appropriate solemnity. Please, share our fire a while. She settles near the hearth, her movements displaying the stiffness that cold brings to aging joints. From inside her layers of woolen garments, she produces a small wooden pipe and a tiny pouch of dried herbs, not precious tobacco, which is far too expensive for commoners like yourselves, but a mixture of local plants that provide a similar, if harsher, smoking experience. May I? She asks, gesture indicating her desire to light the pipe from your fire. You nod permission, though the request is largely ceremonial. No one would refuse an elder the comfort of a smoke in winter, especially one who has arrived bearing gifts. The herbs in her pipe, colt's foot, mullein and others gathered in season and dried for winter use, release a pungent aroma as they smolder, adding their scent to the dwelling's already complex atmosphere of smoke, damp wool, and simmering mushrooms. The Lord's steward came through the village this morning. She informs you between careful puffs that send small clouds of herbal smoke toward the roof. Says there will be distribution from the manor granary before week's end. This confirms what your spouse heard at the mill. lending credibility to the promise of relief. But experience has taught caution in such matters. Did he say how much? You ask, stirring the pot where mushrooms now simmer with the last of the turnip, carefully cut to remove the moldy portions. A measure for each household, she replies, her expression suggesting skepticism similar to your own. Though what constitutes a measure seems to change with the steward's mood and the Lord's generosity. The conversation continues in this vein, sharing information, assessing prospects, comparing current conditions to winters remembered from years past. Throughout, hunger remains present in the hollow beneath your ribs, in the lightness of your head, in the way your attention occasionally drifts from the elder's words to fix instead on the slowly simmering pot. When the old woman finally takes her leave, promising to return the following day to share techniques for preparing bark bread, you turn your full attention to the evening meal. The mushroom and turnip mixture has simmered long enough to soften even the toughest fungi. To this you add the pine needles and a precious pinch of salt saved from autumn. The resulting pottage, while still thin by harvest time standards, offers more substance than this morning's meal. When your spouse and children return from their various tasks, they bring with them not only physical evidence of the day's work, gathered bark, kindling, a bucket of relatively clean snow for melting, but also the invisible burden of hunger sharpened by exertion. It shows in the slight tremor of hands, in eyes that immediately seek out the simmering pot, in movements that conserve energy wherever possible. The family gathers around the hearth for the evening meal with the reverence of those who understand that nourishment cannot be taken for granted. Wooden bowls are wiped clean once again. Posture becomes more attentive. Conversation pauses as the pottage is carefully ladled, each recipient watching to ensure fair distribution of the solid elements. As always, your spouse receives the largest portion, the children next according to age and need, with you accepting what remains. Tonight, what remains includes several pieces of mushroom and a few fragments of turnip, more substance than you've had in days. The meal is consumed slowly, each spoonful considered and appreciated. Your middle child saves a small piece of mushroom for last, extending the experience of chewing something solid. Your youngest, whose appetite has been diminished by the lingering cough, struggles to finish even their modest portion, prompting quiet encouragement from their siblings. Remember how the mushrooms help you grow strong. Your eldest daughter murmurs, like the ones we gathered after the autumn rains that made the good stew. This reference to better times, to meals that actually satisfied hunger, rather than merely acknowledged it, seems to help. The youngest manages a few more spoonfuls before declaring themselves finished. After the meal, preparations begin for night. The fire is banked carefully to conserve fuel while maintaining enough heat to last until morning. The sleeping area is arranged once again, straw straightened, blankets and cloaks layered for maximum warmth, family members positioned according to need and vulnerability. Before sleep claims you all, your spouse shares news from the village gleaned during the day's activities. A child in the charcoal burner's family has developed a serious coughing sickness that sometimes claims the weakest during winter. The blacksmith's apprentice suffered frostbite while collecting ice for storage. The priest has announced additional prayers for the swift arrival of spring. These tidings, sober as they are, form part of the essential knowledge network that helps the community navigate winter's challenges. Awareness of others' hardships provides context for your own struggles and alerts you to specific dangers requiring vigilance. Sleep comes more easily tonight than some, the modest satisfaction of mushrooms and turnips creating a temporary respite from hunger's most insistent demands. But even in sleep, your body knows its deprivation. Dreams are populated with food, tables laden with bread and cheese, pots bubbling with meat stews, orchards heavy with unreachable fruit. You wake before dawn as usual, the dream banquet fading as consciousness returns. Beside you, your family continues sleeping, their breathing creating small clouds in the cold air of early morning. Your stomach cramps sharply, hunger reasserting itself after the brief respite of sleep. Rising carefully, you move to the hearth, where the night's banked fire awaits resurrection. Another day of managed deprivation begins. The following days establish a rhythm of scarcity. Each morning starts with assessment: how much remains in the root cellar, in the flour box, in the bundles of dried herbs. Each meal represents a careful balancing of immediate need against future necessity. Each family member adapts to persistent hunger in their own way, the youngest becoming quieter, the middle child more restless, the eldest more focused on tasks that distract from discomfort. Your spouse returns from work at the mill with the promised payment, a small sack of rye flour that represents significant wealth in this season of emptiness. The flour is immediately secured in the wooden box, a portion mentally allocated for immediate use, while the remainder is preserved for the week still to come. That evening, you prepare bark bread. The process is labor-intensive, beginning with the careful scraping of inner bark collected from specific trees, birch and pine primarily, avoiding the bitter varieties like oak. This inner bark, the living layer just beneath the rough exterior, contains starches that can provide minimal nutrition when properly processed. The bark is dried near the fire until it becomes brittle enough to grind. Using a stone mortar and wooden pestle, tools reserved for food preparation, you and your eldest daughter reduce the dried bark to a coarse powder. This powder is then mixed with the precious rye flour in a ratio that favors bark over grain by necessity. If not preference, to this mixture, you add the last of the dried berries, carefully rehydrated in warm water, and a small amount of rendered fat scraped from its storage container. Water brings the ingredients together into a stiff dough that lacks the elasticity of proper bread dough, but can still be formed into flat cakes. These cakes, placed directly on the hearth stones to bake, fill the dwelling with an aroma that is both promising and disappointing, promising in its bread-like qualities, disappointing in the underlying bitterness that no amount of berries can fully disguise. When the bark bread is finally ready, the family gathers to share this humble creation. The texture is dense, the flavor complex in ways that conventional bread is not, hints of forest and earth mingling with the familiar notes of grain. It requires significant chewing, an attribute that extends the eating experience and provides a form of satisfaction beyond nutritional value. Not so bad, your middle child declares after careful consideration, though his expression suggests otherwise. But hunger makes even bitter bark palatable, and the solid substance in the stomach offers relief from persistent emptiness that liquid pottage cannot provide. The promised distribution from the manor granary occurs 2 days later. Your spouse and eldest daughter join the queue of villagers waiting outside the stone storehouse, where the Lord's surplus is kept. When their turn comes, they receive the allotted measure, a small sack of mixed grain, primarily rye with some barley. Less than hoped for, but more than feared. This supplement to your dwindling stores represents a significant reprieve, extending your resources perhaps another week or 10 days. The grain is coarsely ground using the hand quern, a simple stone grinding tool that most households possess, and immediately incorporated into the day's bread making. The resulting loaf, while still containing a proportion of bark to extend the precious grain, offers significantly better nutrition and flavor than the pure bark bread of days before. When it emerges from its hearthstone baking, the crust lightly browned and the interior steaming, it represents the first true satisfaction available in weeks. That evening's meal, a thin pottage of melted snow, dried herbs, and the few remaining root vegetables accompanied by slices of this improved bread, creates a rare moment of contentment. For a brief time, hunger's voice is quieted, its constant presence in bones and belly temporarily muted. But such reprieves are short-lived in winter's depth. The body, receiving slightly more than it has become accustomed to, responds by awakening rather than silencing its demands. Hunger, briefly appeased, returns with renewed insistence, speaking more loudly than before this temporary satisfaction. The days continue their progression towards spring, though evidence of the changing season remains scarce. Snow still blankets the landscape, thawing slightly during daylight hours, only to refreeze at night, creating treacherous conditions for gathering wood or checking snares. The temperature remains below freezing most days, with occasional bitter winds that find every gap in the dwelling's modest defenses. Your family adapts to these conditions as generations before have done. Activities that require greater strength, wood gathering, water hauling, occasional hunting expeditions are conducted during the marginally warmer midday hours. Tasks that can be performed indoors, mending, tool repair, food preparation, occupy mornings and evenings when outdoor excursions would demand too much precious energy. Throughout these adaptations, hunger remains a constant companion, speaking through physical sensations that have become so familiar, they seem almost normal. The persistent emptiness beneath your ribs, the occasional lightheadedness when rising quickly, the slight tremor in hands that perform delicate tasks. Your body has adjusted to receiving less than it requires, burning stored fat and eventually muscle to make up the difference. The physical changes are evident in everyone. Faces have grown more angular since autumn, collarbones more pronounced, wrists more slender. Clothing that fit properly at harvest time now hangs loosely, requiring additional cinching of belts or improvised pins to maintain proper coverage. Most concerning are the changes in your youngest, whose small frame has less reserve to draw upon. The child's eyes seem increasingly large in the thinning face, limbs like saplings where once there was the roundness of early childhood. The persistent cough, while improved from its worst days, returns each night, a dry, rasping sound that punctuates the darkness. The hunger speaks in bones, your eldest daughter observes one evening as she helps prepare the meager supper. Another variation of bark bread and thin pottage, the ingredients adjusted slightly based on what could be gathered that day. Grandmother used to say that. You nod, remembering the old woman who lived long enough to see your eldest born, but not beyond that harsh winter. She knew the hunger well, survived more winters than most. How did she do it? Your daughter asks, hands continuing their work of shredding the last dried herbs into the simmering pot. Survive so many? The question contains layers of meaning, curiosity about family history. Yes, but also a more immediate concern about techniques for endurance in the face of present deprivation. She was clever about food, you explain, slicing the bark bread into the thinnest possible portions to create the illusion of adequacy. Knew what could be eaten when nothing seemed available. Kept secrets about where certain plants could be found even in snow. Understood how to make the body accept less without surrendering to weakness. Your daughter considers this, her expression suggesting she's filing away this information alongside her own growing knowledge of survival strategies. At 12, she already understands more about hunger management than any child should need to know. And she told stories. You continue. Said that feeding the mind helped quiet the stomach's complaints. This reference to storytelling prompts a request from your middle child, who has been listening nearby while completing his assigned task of preparing kindling for morning. Tell us about the feast days, he asks, setting aside his work and moving closer to the hearth. About Lammas, when the first bread is baked from new wheat. Though Lammas, the August celebration marking the beginning of the harvest season, lies many months in the future, the request reflects the hunger dreams that have become common as winter progresses. These dreams and fantasies of abundance serve as both torment and comfort, reminding the hungry of what has been and what might be again. You oblige, setting aside the evening's preparations momentarily to paint verbal pictures of harvest celebrations. You describe the communal baking of bread from the first threshed wheat, the blessing of the loaves at the church, the rare allowance of white bread for the feast, while the coarser, darker everyday loaves return afterward. As you speak, you notice how the children's expressions change. Eyes growing distant, imagining scenes of plenty that contrast sharply with current reality. Even your spouse, typically focused on practical matters, pauses in their task of repairing a torn shoe to listen, momentarily transported from the hunger-filled present to a memory of satisfaction. The storytelling serves its purpose, distracting from physical discomfort, while reinforcing the cyclical nature of deprivation and abundance. Winter and its hunger represent not permanent condition, but passage, difficult, dangerous passage to be sure, but passage nonetheless, leading eventually to renewed plenty. When the evening meal is finally ready, it offers little physical satisfaction, thin pottage that contains more water than substance, bark bread that requires extended chewing to generate even minimal nourishment. But the shared experience of eating, combined with the lingering effects of storytelling, creates a form of sustenance beyond mere calories. Night falls early, as it always does in winter, darkness settling over the landscape while the evening is still young by summer standards. The family prepares for sleep with the now familiar choreography of conservation, banking the fire, arranging sleeping positions for maximum warmth sharing, layering every available fabric against the night's deepening cold. As you settle beside your slumbering family, hunger continues its quiet conversation with your body. It speaks in the hollow beneath your ribs, in the lightness of your head, in dreams that transport you to tables laden with food you cannot quite reach. But it speaks also of endurance, of the body's remarkable capacity to adapt, to survive on less than it desires, to continue functioning when resources fall short of requirements. The hunger that speaks in bones tells a story of its own, a story of winter's grip and human resilience, of the fine line between barely enough and not quite enough, of the quiet, desperate genius required to stretch meager resources across seemingly endless days of need. And so you sleep, hunger your constant companion, your body continuing its careful rationing of energy, even in unconsciousness. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own manifestations of scarcity, but for now, sleep offers its own form of nourishment. a temporary reprieve from awareness, if not from need. In the deepest part of night, when even the fire has dimmed to nearly nothing, it comes, a soft, rasping cough from the sleeping pallet, where your family lies huddled together against the cold. The sound is small, barely disturbing the heavy silence of the winter-bound dwelling. But to your ears, attuned through years of parenthood and seasons of vigilance, it might as well be a shout. Your youngest child coughs again, the sound wetter now, containing depths that weren't present in the dry irritation of previous days. Without needing to touch the small forehead, you already know what you'll find. Skin hot and dry despite the chill air, the fever that winter inevitably brings when bodies weakened by hunger and cold can no longer maintain their defenses. You rise quietly, careful not to disturb the others who need their rest. The packed earth floor is cold beneath your bare feet as you make your way to the hearth, where embers still glow faintly beneath their coating of protective ash. With practiced movements, you revive the fire, feeding it the smallest pieces of precious fuel until a modest flame appears, casting weak, flickering light across the single-room dwelling. In this uncertain illumination, you gather what you need, a cup of snow from the bucket by the door, to be melted for drinking, dried herbs from the diminishing bundles hanging from the roof beams, a small pot to prepare the medicinal tea that might help reduce the fever. These preparations are conducted in near silence, with the efficiency born of experience and necessity. The sound of quiet movement wakes your spouse, who rises to join you by the fire. No words are needed. Both of you have witnessed this scene before, have participated in this midnight ritual of care and concern. While you prepare the herbal tea, they check on the sleeping children, placing a calloused hand against the youngest forehead to confirm what the cough has already told you. "Fever's high," they whisper, returning to the hearth. Their expression reflects the worry neither of you will voice fully, the knowledge that winter illness can progress quickly, from concerning to dangerous, especially in the youngest and oldest, especially when bodies are already compromised by months of insufficient nourishment. Together you complete the preparation of the remedy. Melted snow water brought to a simmer, dried fever, few and willow bark added to the steaming liquid. A precious half-spoonful of honey, scraped from the nearly empty container, where it has been hoarded specifically for medicinal use. This mixture, nature's medicine made available through knowledge passed down through generations, represents your first line of defense against the illness that has found its way into your home. When the tea has steeped long enough to extract the plant's healing properties, your spouse gently wakes the ailing child while you strain the liquid through a clean cloth into a wooden cup. The youngest wakes reluctantly, confused by the interruption of sleep, face flushed with fever's unnatural heat. "Drink this," you encourage, supporting the small head as the cup is brought to parched lips. "It will help you feel better." The child complies, grimacing slightly at the bitter taste despite the honey's attempt at sweetening. Several sips are managed before exhaustion reclaims dominance, pulling the young one back toward feverish sleep. Your eldest daughter has awakened now, quickly assessing the situation with the premature confidence of a child who has witnessed illness before. Without being asked, she retrieves a cloth, dampens it with melted snow, and places it gently on her sibling's hot forehead. This small act of care, cooling the fever-heated skin, represents another piece of knowledge preserved and passed down, another tool in the limited arsenal available to combat winter's silent assault. "I'll watch for a while," she offers, settling beside the sleeping pallet. "You and father should rest." Though barely 12, she understands the importance of shared vigilance, of conserving adult strength for the demands of daylight. You hesitate, reluctant to relinquish your protective post, but reason prevails. The illness that has taken hold will not release its grip quickly. Maintaining a rotation of watchers offers the best chance of providing consistent care, while ensuring no one person becomes too depleted. You and your spouse return to the sleeping pallet, positioning yourselves to share warmth with both the ailing youngest and the still slumbering middle child. Sleep returns reluctantly, punctuated by periodic coughing from the sick child, and the constant awareness that illness has breached your modest defenses. Dawn arrives gray and subdued, filtering through the oiled parchment window, covering with weak illumination that does little to dispel the dwelling's shadows. The fire maintained through the night by whoever's watch it was, provides more light than the hidden sun. Your eldest daughter, having taken the final watch, is already preparing the morning pottage, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone trying not to disturb the ill. The fever has not broken. If anything, it seems to have strengthened its hold overnight, claiming more of your youngest child's limited reserves. The small face appears both flushed and somehow diminished. fever burning through already minimal fat stores, consuming energy the body can ill afford to spare. The breathings change. Your eldest reports quietly as you check the patient, more rattling inside. You listen carefully, noting the moist sound that accompanies each breath, evidence that the illness has descended from throat to chest, taking up residence in lungs already irritated by months of smoky air. This progression is concerning, but not unexpected. Winter illness often follows this path, moving deeper into the body as days pass. The morning routine adapts to accommodate this new challenge. Your spouse delays their departure for wood gathering to help move the sleeping pallet closer to the fire, providing more warmth for the sick child. Your middle child, now awake and aware of his sibling's condition, is assigned the task of collecting the cleanest snow he can find, snow that will be melted for drinking and for cooling compresses. Breakfast is prepared and consumed with an undercurrent of tension that even the youngest can sense. The usual careful rationing continues, your spouse and elder children receiving the larger portions needed to maintain strength for essential tasks, with you taking what remains. But today, a small amount of the precious food is set aside in hopes that the fever-stricken child might manage a few mouthfuls when consciousness returns more fully. As your spouse and eldest daughter prepare to leave the dwelling for their necessary tasks, gathering wood and checking snares that might provide desperately needed protein, you provide quiet instructions. If you pass the wise woman's cottage, tell her of the fever. Ask if she has any fever-few to spare. The village's wise woman, an elderly widow who serves as healer and midwife, maintains the most extensive collection of medicinal herbs in the community. While her services typically require payment, a chicken, labor in her garden, a share of harvest, serious childhood illness sometimes merits charity. They nod understanding before wrapping themselves in whatever outer garments can be spared for their expedition. The door opens and closes quickly, allowing minimal cold air to enter but still causing a momentary drop in temperature that makes the fire flicker and the sick child stir restlessly. Alone with your two younger children, one ill, one watching with the solemn concern of a child who has seen how quickly winter can claim the vulnerable, you begin the day's indoor tasks. The fire requires constant attention, especially now that its warmth serves not just for cooking and baseline comfort, but as active medicine for laboring lungs. The dwelling itself needs maintenance. A leak in the thatch that developed during yesterday's brief thawing must be temporarily patched until proper repairs can be made in spring. The packed earth floor requires sweeping to control the dust that might further irritate breathing. The meager bedding should be aired if possible to prevent the dampness that encourages illness to linger. These tasks proceed slowly, your attention divided between necessary maintenance and the supervision of your sick child. The fever continues its steady burn, consuming precious energy, causing occasional restless movements and distressed murmurs from parched lips. You administer the herbal tea whenever consciousness allows, supporting the hot head, encouraging small sips that might help combat the fever from within. Your middle child assists as best he can, his natural restlessness tempered by concern for his sibling. He fetches what you ask for, holds compresses in place when you need both hands for other tasks, and occasionally speaks softly to the patient. One-sided conversations about what games they'll play when health returns, about the birds he saw yesterday, about nothing of consequence that nonetheless provides a thread of normalcy in this altered atmosphere. Midday brings your spouse back to the dwelling, arms laden with the day's gathering, a modest bundle of wood, some pine needles that can be boiled for their vitamin content, and most precious, a small packet of herbs from the wise woman. She sent fever, few and horehound, they report, placing the carefully wrapped package in your waiting hands, said to brew them together, as strong as possible. The child should drink it hot, as much as can be managed. This remedy, these specific herbs in this particular combination, represents the accumulated knowledge of generations of healers. The fever few will help reduce the fever that consumes precious energy. The horehound will help loosen the congestion that threatens to suffocate tender lungs. Together they offer no guarantees but improve the odds, in a season where favorable odds are rare commodities. You prepare the medicinal tea immediately, using a portion of the day's clean snow melted carefully by the fire. The herbs, brittle, gray-green leaves and stems, release their potent aroma as they steep in the hot water. The smell fills the small dwelling, sharp and medicinal, overlaying the usual odors of smoke, damp wool, and human habitation. When the remedy has brewed to proper strength, you strain it through a clean cloth into a wooden cup, allowing it to cool just enough that it won't burn but remains hot enough to maximize effectiveness. Your spouse gently lifts the sick child into a semi-upright position, supporting the weakened body while you bring the cup to fever-cracked lips. "Drink, little one," you encourage softly. "This will help the hurt inside." The child complies with the unresisting acquiescence of the truly ill, managing several swallows before exhaustion reclaims dominance. It's more than you dared hope for, enough of the medicine to perhaps make a difference, to perhaps begin turning the course of the illness. Your eldest daughter returns in the early afternoon, bringing with her the disappointing news that the snares remain empty and a small bundle of bark collected for bread making. Her expression changes from tired resignation to sharp concern as she assesses her sibling's condition. "No better?" she asks, though the answer is evident in the labored breathing and flushed face of the patient. You shake your head, offering the simple truth, "No better yet, but the wise woman's remedy may need time to work." This explanation, this expression of cautious hope, is provided as much for the ears of your other children as for actual expectation. Hope, like food and warmth, must be rationed in winter, distributed in amounts large enough to sustain but not so generous that its inevitable disappointment crushes the spirit entirely. As afternoon transitions toward evening, bringing with it the early darkness of winter, the illness maintains its hold. The fever neither breaks nor intensifies, remaining at a level that concerns without yet becoming truly dangerous. The cough continues, wet and productive now, bringing up phlegm that represents both problem and partial solution, the body's attempt to clear itself of infection. The evening meal is prepared and consumed in the modified routine that illness imposes. Food remains carefully rationed according to need and function, with a small portion set aside for when the sick child might wake enough to manage a few mouthfuls. Conversation is minimized. Voices kept low out of both energy conservation and consideration for the ill. Plans for tomorrow are discussed in practical terms. Who will gather wood? Who will stay with the patient? What tasks can be delayed if necessary? Night falls fully, the darkness outside absolute, except for occasional moonlight reflecting off snow when clouds briefly part. Inside, the fire provides the only illumination, casting flickering shadows across the walls and ceiling. These shadows, elongated, distorted versions of people and objects, create an atmosphere that seems appropriate to the presence of illness. There is something not quite natural in the dwelling tonight, something that moves according to its own rhythms rather than human intention. Once again, the family establishes a rotation for night watching. Your eldest will take the first shift, then your spouse, with you handling the final hours before dawn when fever often intensifies. Your middle child is allowed uninterrupted sleep, a concession to his age and the recognition that one family member at least should maintain full strength. During your spouse's watch, sometime in the deepest part of night, the fever breaks. The transition is not dramatic, no sudden cooling of skin, no profound shift from restlessness to peaceful slumber. Rather, it's a subtle change noted only because of vigilant attention. The flushed face gradually returns to more natural color. The heated skin slowly releases its fire. The labored breathing eases marginally. When you rise for your watch, your spouse reports this development with cautious optimism. The heat has lessened. They whisper, careful not to wake the others, and the breathing seems easier. You place your hand on the small forehead, confirming the slight but significant improvement. The skin remains warmer than normal, but has lost the frightening heat of high fever. The patient sleeps more naturally now, chest still rising and falling with congested effort, but with marginally more ease than hours before. This improvement, while welcome, doesn't signal the end of danger. The illness that has taken hold, this winter visitor that finds its way into so many homes during the leanest months, rarely retreats quickly. The fever may have diminished, but the congestion remains, and weakness from days of minimal nourishment creates its own vulnerability. Your vigilance cannot ease yet. Dawn arrives with thin, gray light filtering through the window covering. Another day of illness and adaptation begins. The morning assessment brings modest encouragement. The fever remains lower, though still present. The cough continues but seems slightly less labored. Brief periods of wakefulness occur during which small amounts of broth and medicinal tea can be administered. Today will be better, your eldest daughter declares with the conviction of youth as she prepares to depart for the day's gathering activities. Her confidence, whether genuine or assumed, for the benefit of others, provides a brief lightening of the atmosphere that has hung heavy since the illness made itself known. The day progresses with its necessary tasks. Your spouse departs for wood gathering and to check if work might be available at the mill. providing either payment in flour or at least the opportunity to warm themselves in the relative comfort of the larger building. Your eldest takes your middle child with her to collect snow, bark, and whatever else might be found to supplement your dwindling stores. Alone with your recovering patient, you tend to both the fire and the illness. The wise woman's remedy is prepared again, this time accepted with greater awareness by the sick child, who manages to drink nearly half the cup before drifting back to the sleep that represents the body's own best medicine. Throughout the morning, you divide attention between care and necessary indoor tasks. Bedding dampened by fever sweat is hung near the fire to dry. The floor is swept again to minimize dust. Preparations are made for the evening meal, extending meager ingredients through careful management. Throughout these activities, one ear remains attuned to the breathing from the palate, alert for changes that might signal either improvement or decline. Midday brings your middle child back to the dwelling, sent home by his sister who continued to the area where snares had been set. He carries a small bundle of kindling and reports that the wise woman has asked after the patient's condition. She said to tell you that she will visit before sunset. He informs you, carefully placing his gathered wood in the designated spot near the hearth. She wants to check the breathing herself. This news represents both concern and care. The wise woman rarely makes house calls during winter, unless conditions warrant direct intervention. Her willingness to traverse snow-covered paths while daylight remains indicates genuine concern for your child's welfare. Concern based perhaps on experience with similar cases that did not resolve favorably. The afternoon passes with continued small improvements in the patient's condition. Periods of wakefulness lengthen slightly, allowing for more substantial intake of broth and tea. The cough remains but begins to sound clearer, bringing up phlegm that gradually changes from dark and thick to lighter and more liquid. Another positive sign recognized by those familiar with winter's respiratory afflictions. Your spouse returns as daylight begins to fade, bringing news rather than resources. The miller says 3 in the village now have the lung sickness, they report, warming stiff hands by the fire. The charcoal burner's youngest, the blacksmith's wife, and old Willem, who lives alone by the stream. This information, this confirmation that illness extends beyond your dwelling, creates mixed feelings. There is concern for neighbors and community members, particularly for elderly Willem, whose solitary circumstances make illness especially dangerous. But there is also a certain validation in knowing that this sickness represents a broader pattern, rather than specific failure of your family's defenses. As promised, the wise woman arrives before sunset, her approach announced by the distinctive tapping of the walking stick she uses to navigate uneven terrain. Though not truly elderly, perhaps 50 winters, based on her own accounting, her body bears the marks of a lifetime of service to the community, hands gnarled from constant work with herbs and remedies, back slightly bent from bending over sickbeds and birthing pallets, face lined with the knowledge of both healing and failing to heal. So, the little one has the lung sickness, she states rather than asks, moving directly to the sleeping patient after the briefest acknowledgement of the rest of the family. Her assessment is methodical and efficient, hands checking temperature at forehead, neck, and chest, ears listening carefully to the breathing and cough, eyes examining the color of lips and the phlegm coughed into a cloth. When her examination concludes, she straightens with a small grunt of effort and delivers her verdict. The fever has broken, which is good. The lungs still hold sickness, but they're fighting well. Continue the tea I sent, fever few and whorehound, and add thyme if you have it. She pauses, considering, and keep the child upright when possible. The fluid settles in the lungs when lying flat. These instructions, this professional assessment, provide both reassurance and direction. The illness is recognized. Its pattern familiar to someone with deep experience. The recommended treatments lie within your capabilities. The prognosis, while not guaranteed, offers reasonable hope. Before departing, the wise woman examines your other children briefly, checking for signs that the illness might be spreading within the household. Finding no immediate cause for concern, she provides a small additional packet of herbs from her seemingly bottomless pockets. For prevention, she explains, handing the package to your eldest daughter. Brew it weak for those who aren't yet sick. Help strengthen against catching it. This preventative measure, this attempt to create a boundary around the illness already present, represents another layer of knowledge preserved and transmitted through generations of healers. Like so many winter strategies, it offers no certainties, but improves odds in a season where favorable odds are precious commodities. The wise woman declines your offer to share the evening meal, aware that your resources are already stretched thin by illness and ongoing scarcity. Instead, she accepts a promise of future payment, assistance with her garden when spring finally arrives, labor that represents a fair exchange for her knowledge and herbs. As she departs, returning to the gathering darkness outside, she leaves behind an atmosphere subtly altered by her visit. There is more confidence now, more sense of following a known path rather than facing uncharted territory. The illness remains serious, winter respiratory afflictions always are, but it has been named, assessed, and given appropriate response. The evening progresses with implementation of the wise woman's guidance. When your sick child wakes, you and your spouse arrange blankets and clothing to create a semi-upright position that allows for better breathing. The modified medicinal tea, now including thyme from your diminishing stores, is prepared and administered in small, frequent amounts. The preventative brew is prepared for the rest of the family, its milder flavor causing fewer grimaces than the more potent sickbed remedy. Night falls, bringing with it the ancient vulnerability that darkness has always imposed on the ill. Something about nighttime intensifies both symptoms and fears, creating a landscape where recovery seems more distant and danger more immediate. Once again, the family establishes a rotation for watching, for measuring each labored breath against the previous, for monitoring the precarious balance between improvement and decline. During your watch, in those deepest hours when the fire burns lowest and even the night creatures have fallen silent, your sick child stirs and opens eyes that seem clearer than they have in days. "I'm thirsty," comes the small voice, weak but present, aware. You help raise the child to a better drinking position, supporting the still too warm head as you offer the cooled medicinal tea. It's accepted eagerly, several swallows managed with greater coordination than previously displayed. "Does it still hurt inside?" you ask softly, referring to the chest pain that accompanied the worst of the coughing. A small nod, but then qualification. "Not as much. Just when I cough hard." This conversation, this return to coherent interaction, represents significant improvement. Though weakness remains evident in voice and movement, awareness has returned more fully, suggesting the body has moved from crisis to recovery. The remaining night hours pass with periodic repetition of this scene. Waking, drinking, brief exchanges, return to healing sleep. By dawn, a pattern has been established that offers cautious optimism. The illness has not departed. Congestion remains audible in each breath. Fever still comes and goes in lesser waves. Weakness continues to limit movement, but its hold has loosened appreciably. Morning brings your spouse's departure for work at the mill, a full day's labor having been arranged in exchange for payment that will help replenish your depleted stores. Your eldest daughter assumes responsibility for outdoor gathering, taking your middle child with her despite his reluctance to leave his recovering sibling. "The fresh air will keep you strong," you remind him as he wraps his outer garment more securely. And your sister needs help carrying what she finds. Alone with your patient once more, you continue the regimen established during previous days, medicinal tea administered regularly, position adjusted to facilitate breathing, small amounts of nourishment offered whenever wakefulness permits. The improvement continues its gradual progression, each hour bringing marginally more strength, slightly easier breathing, periods of wakefulness that lengthen noticeably. By midday, your sick child has progressed to sitting fully upright without support for short periods, managing several spoonfuls of thin gruel prepared specifically for this purpose, and even showing interest in surroundings that had been ignored during the worst of the illness. "When can I get up?" comes the question that signals genuine improvement. Not yet well, but well enough to contemplate movement beyond the sleeping pallet. "Not today," you answer, tempering the disappointment with reassurance. "But soon if you continue getting stronger." This promise, this acknowledgement that recovery has genuinely begun, brings a small smile to the face that has shown only pain and confusion for days. The smile transforms the countenance, returning some of the childhood that illness had temporarily stripped away. The remainder of the day passes in this atmosphere of cautious improvement. Your eldest children return from their gathering expedition with modest but welcome contributions to the household stores. Some bark for bread making, pine needles for their vitamin content, an unexpected prize, a rabbit caught in one of the snares. This protein source, this concentrated nourishment that has been so lacking in recent weeks, represents a significant boost to your family's resilience. The rabbit will provide not only meat for immediate consumption, but bone broth that can help sustain your recovering child and reinforce the other's resistance to illness. The meal preparation that evening takes on a nearly ceremonial quality. The rabbit is carefully skinned, its modest meat separated from bones with meticulous attention to extracting maximum benefit. The meat is divided into portions, most to be consumed immediately with a small amount preserved for the following day. The bones, along with head and feet, are placed in the iron pot with water, wild garlic saved from autumn, and the last wizened carrot from the root cellar. This mixture will simmer through the night, extracting every particle of nourishment from these precious ingredients. As the dwelling fills with the aroma of cooking meat, a scent that has been absent for weeks, there's a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The illness that has dominated recent days recedes somewhat from collective consciousness, replaced by anticipation of genuine nourishment. Even your sick child responds to the scent, showing more interest in food than at any point since the fever began. The evening meal, while still modest by non-winter standards, represents a feast compared to recent provisions. Each family member receives a small portion of rabbit meat supplemented by bark bread and the thin vegetable broth that has been a constant throughout winter. The protein, the concentrated energy this meat provides, offers sustenance that plant-based foods alone cannot match, particularly in bodies depleted by months of inadequate nutrition. Your sick child manages only a few mouthfuls of the precious meat, appetite still diminished by lingering illness. But those few bites, rich in nutrients absent from recent diet, will contribute significantly to the rebuilding of strength. The bone broth, which will continue developing its nutritional potency overnight, will provide easily digestible sustenance in the days to come. Night brings the now familiar routine of banking the fire, arranging sleeping positions, and establishing the watch rotation. But tonight the atmosphere has changed subtly. The fear that accompanied those first difficult nights has diminished, replaced by tired relief and cautious optimism. The illness remains present, still audible in congested breathing, still visible in weakness and pallor, but its threat has receded from immediate to manageable. Your watch comes in those pre-dawn hours when darkness seems most complete. The dwelling is quiet except for the soft sounds of sleeping breaths and occasional crackle from the fire. Your sick child sleeps peacefully now, breathing still labored but significantly improved from days earlier. The small face, illuminated by the fire's dim glow, shows lingering signs of illness, but has lost the alarming flush of high fever. In this moment of relative calm, your mind turns to the broader patterns of winter survival. The illness that visited your home, that still resides there in diminished form, is only one of winter's many threats. Hunger continues its quiet conversation with every family member's body. Cold remains a constant presence just beyond the fire's limited reach. The darkness of these shortened days affects spirits already challenged by physical deprivation, yet within these challenges, within this season that always claims some who cannot endure its demands, there exists a stubborn persistence. Your family has faced illness and appears to be emerging on the other side. The rabbit in the snare provided unexpected sustenance at a critical moment. The wise woman shared knowledge accumulated through generations of similar struggles. These elements, luck, community, preserved wisdom, combine with your own family's resilience to create a pathway through winter's darkest aspects. Dawn arrives, bringing with it the subtle shift in atmosphere that suggests another day has been successfully navigated. Your spouse wakes, assesses your sick child's condition with experienced hands checking temperature and chest movement, and nods approval at the continued improvement. Better again, they confirm quietly. The breathing comes easier now. This assessment, this confirmation of what you've observed throughout your watch, allows for adjustment of the day's plans. Your spouse will check the snares again before reporting to the mill for another day's work. Your eldest will focus on gathering herbs identified by the wise woman as particularly beneficial for lung recovery. Your middle child will remain at the dwelling, helping with indoor tasks while providing company for his recovering sibling, who has begun to notice the isolation that illness imposes. The illness that arrived in silence during the deepest night has begun its retreat, leaving behind a family marked by the experience, but not broken by it. There will be lingering effects, weakness that may persist for weeks, vulnerability to recurrence if conditions deteriorate, the depletion of already limited resources that illness always imposes. But the immediate crisis has passed. As you prepare the morning meal, thin gruel enriched with a small amount of the precious bone broth that has simmered overnight, you find yourself cataloging the lessons this episode has reinforced: the importance of preserved knowledge about medicinal plants, the value of community connections that provide support during crisis, the body's remarkable capacity to heal itself when given even minimal assistance, the subtle line between recovery and decline that winter constantly presents. These lessons, this hard-earned wisdom about survival in the leanest season, have been accumulated through generations of similar experiences. Each family that endures a winter illness contributes to this knowledge base, refining understanding of symptoms, treatments, and warning signs that indicate when more drastic intervention is needed. Your sick child wakes fully now, showing greater alertness than previous mornings. The small voice, still weak but gaining strength, asks for food rather than having to be coaxed to eat. This request, this return of appetite, represents another significant milestone in recovery. As you serve the morning meal, distributing the enhanced gruel with particular attention to your recuperating child's portion, you notice how the other family members have been affected by this episode. Your eldest daughter moves with increased confidence in her caregiving role, having proven her capabilities during crisis. Your middle child shows greater gentleness toward his younger sibling, the competitive edge that normally defines their interaction temporarily softened by awareness of vulnerability. Your spouse watches the sick child with the particular intensity of a parent who has confronted the possibility of loss and found it intolerable. These changes, these subtle shifts in family dynamics that illness creates, will gradually fade as full health returns and normal patterns reassert themselves. But something of this experience will remain embedded in your collective memory, adding another layer to the complex understanding of winter survival that your family carries forward. The illness that waited for silence found its opportunity in the vulnerable space where hunger, cold, and darkness converge. It spoke through fever, through congested lungs, through weakness that consumed even the energy required for full consciousness. But it has been answered by resilience, by accumulated knowledge, by the stubborn refusal to surrender what can be preserved. As winter continues its slow progression toward eventual spring, other challenges will arise. The hunger that speaks in bones remains a constant companion. The cold that presses against every vulnerability in your dwelling's defenses continues its patient assault, but the illness that arrived in darkness has begun its retreat, diminishing from acute threat to manageable condition. In this temporary reprieve, this moment of recovery rather than crisis, there exists a quiet victory, not triumph. For winter allows no absolute victories until its proper end, but survival, continuation, endurance. The fire burns steadily now, tended with the care that all precious resources demand in winter. Your recovering child sits propped against folded garments, sipping bone broth from a wooden cup, cheeks showing the first hint of returning color. The illness remains present but diminished, its power to threaten life reduced to lingering weakness that time and nourishment will gradually overcome. Outside, snow begins to fall again, large, lazy flakes that suggest accumulation rather than brief flurry. This new snow will make gathering more difficult, will further isolate your dwelling from the broader community, will add another layer of challenge to daily survival. But within the rough walls of your home, within the circle defined by the fire's modest warmth, recovery continues its slow progression. The illness that waits for silence has not been vanquished entirely. It never is in winter, merely held at bay until conditions favor its return. But its immediate threat has been addressed through the combined resources of traditional knowledge, community support, and family resilience. And in this moment, this quiet interlude between crisis endured and challenges yet to come, you allow yourself the temporary luxury of relief. Not celebration, for winter permits no premature celebration of survival, but acknowledgement. You have faced the illness that waits for silence, and for now at least, emerged on the other side. The fire flickers, the snow falls, the breathing from the sleeping palate comes easier with each passing hour. Winter continues its course, but you continue as well, carrying forward the knowledge that even in the leanest season, even in the deepest cold, life persists through the darkness toward eventual light. The snow had been falling steadily for 3 days, a relentless accumulation that transformed the landscape into something both beautiful and treacherous. Inside your dwelling, the fire burned as brightly as limited fuel would allow, casting flickering shadows across the walls where your family had gathered in their usual positions, close enough to the hearth to benefit from its modest warmth, far enough from each other to allow some small measure of personal space in quarters grown increasingly cramped as winter progressed. Your youngest child, now recovered enough from the respiratory illness to sit upright for extended periods, leaned against your eldest daughter who absently stroked the little one's hair while staring into the flames. Your middle child sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully carving a small piece of wood into what might eventually become a toy or tool. Your spouse worked methodically at repairing a torn shoe, fingers stiff from cold, but still capable of the precise movements required. You yourself were engaged in the daily assessment of resources, counting the remaining pieces of bark bread, measuring the dwindling supply of dried herbs, calculating how many more days the current store of firewood might last if rationed carefully. These mental calculations had become second nature, a constant background process that informed every decision about consumption and conservation. "Tell us about the tricks," your middle child said suddenly, looking up from his carving. "The ones that let people survive when winter was worse than this." The request came without preamble, but you understood immediately what he was asking for. These stories, these accounts of survival strategies employed by previous generations during particularly harsh winters, had become something of a family tradition, especially in the leanest weeks when encouragement was needed as much as physical nourishment. You set aside the mental inventory and settled more comfortably against the wall. "Very well," you agreed, noting how even your spouse paused in their mending to listen. "Which would you like to hear? The buried carrots? The straw-stuffed shoes? The frozen blood?" "All of them," your eldest daughter requested, her voice betraying the need for distraction from the persistent cold and the monotony that extended confinement imposed. "Start with the buried carrots." You nodded, gathering your thoughts. These weren't simply stories, they were practical knowledge wrapped in narrative, survival techniques preserved through generations, each detail potentially useful should conditions deteriorate beyond their already challenging state. "My grandmother's grandmother," you began, using the traditional opening that placed these accounts firmly in family history while acknowledging their distance, lived through 3 winters so harsh that the wolves came into the village itself. Driven by hunger that matched the villagers' own, the setting established, you continued with the practical heart of the story. She had learned from her own mother that certain vegetables, if stored properly, could last far longer than others, carrots especially. But the root cellar, being merely a shallow pit beneath the floor, would freeze in the deepest cold, ruining anything stored there. Your children nodded understanding. They had seen this themselves in lesser winters, vegetables rendered inedible by freezing and subsequent thawing, precious resources lost to winter's penetrating cold. So instead, in late autumn, she would dig a special pit in the corner of the garden furthest from the house, deeper than a man's height, lined with straw, filled with alternating layers of carrots and more straw. You gestured with your hands, illustrating the dimensions and construction. On top went a thick layer of straw, then soil, then branches to mark the spot. And most importantly, she would build a small fire on top of the spot for several days, burning just enough to thaw the upper soil but not reach the cache below. The fire created a warm spot that attracted the snow. Your spouse interjected, familiar enough with the technique, to add this crucial detail. The snow would pile higher there, creating further insulation. You nodded acknowledgement. Exactly. When food grew scarce in late winter, she would dig through the snow and thawed soil to reach the carrots, still firm and edible when everything else had rotted or frozen. "Could we do that next year?" your middle child asked, the practical application immediately apparent to him. "Perhaps you allowed, though we would need permission to dig so deeply on the plot we're allowed to cultivate." Land use was strictly controlled, with peasant families allocated specific areas for growing food, none of which were technically owned but merely worked at the Lord's discretion. Now the straw shoes prompted your eldest, aware that this technique had more immediate relevance to your current circumstances. "Ah, yes. This comes from your father's side," you noted, nodding toward your spouse who had resumed their mending. "His people lived further north where the cold was even more severe. They discovered that ordinary shoes, even well-made leather ones, couldn't keep feet warm enough during the deepest cold." Your children's attention remained focused, their own cold feet tucked beneath them as if in sympathy with the story's subjects. They developed a method using clean straw, not the straw from bedding that had been compressed and broken, but fresh straw saved specifically for this purpose. They would weave it into dense mats shaped to fit inside the shoes, creating a layer between foot and leather that trapped warmth more effectively than anything else available. Your spouse added practical detail, speaking from family knowledge passed through generations. The key was changing these straw insoles daily. Each night the used straw would be removed and hung near the fire to dry completely. The next morning, fresh straw would be shaped and inserted before venturing outside. "We still do this, don't we?" your youngest asked, old enough to recognize the technique that had been employed throughout recent cold spells. "We do," you confirmed. though true straw has become scarce this late in winter. This acknowledgement of adaptation, of adjusting traditional techniques to accommodate available resources, represented another layer of survival knowledge. The core principle remained valid even when specific materials might need substitution. And the frozen blood. Your middle child asked, returning to the most dramatic of the survival techniques you had mentioned. Was that really a thing people did? You nodded, expression serious. This particular strategy belonged to the category of last resort measures, techniques employed only when starvation loomed as imminent rather than theoretical. During the Great Famine, when 3 summers in succession brought rain that rotted crops in the fields, people remembered an ancient practice from times even more desperate than their own. The dwelling grew quieter, even the fire seeming to dim its crackling as you described this emergency measure. Those who had managed to keep a pig or sheep alive until deep winter would collect its blood at slaughtering. Not unusual in itself. Blood pudding is common enough. But what they discovered was that blood mixed with a small amount of flour, formed into cakes and left to freeze solid, could be preserved almost indefinitely. Your spouse nodded confirmation. The frozen cakes were stored in cloth sacks hung from the roof beams outside, where temperatures remained below freezing. When needed, a cake would be brought inside, thawed and cooked like a dense pancake. It wasn't pleasant eating, you admitted, acknowledging the desperation such measures represented. But it contained nutrients that sustained life when nothing else remained. The iron in blood prevented the weakness that comes when people subsist on bark bread alone for too long. Your children absorbed this information with the solemnity it deserved. None asked if your family had ever resorted to this particular technique. Understanding instinctively that such knowledge was preserved, hopefully never to be needed, but preserved nonetheless because winter's worst possibilities could never be entirely dismissed. A brief silence followed this final account, each family member processing the implications of these survival strategies. They represented more than mere historical curiosity. They formed a practical archive of emergency measures, a catalog of options should conditions deteriorate beyond their current challenging but manageable state. There are other tricks, your spouse offered after a moment, picking up the thread of practical knowledge sharing. Smaller ones, daily practices that don't sound like much but make a difference between enduring and failing. The children's attention shifted, recognizing that these more mundane strategies might have more immediate application to current circumstances. Like sleeping in turns, your spouse continued. Not just for tending the fire or watching the sick, but because a recently vacated sleeping spot retains warmth that benefits the next person. In the coldest times, my ancestors arranged sleeping schedules so that no bedding ever cooled completely. Someone was always warming it for the next person. You nodded, adding another example from your own family tradition. In the practice of heating stones by the fire, then wrapping them in cloth to place at the foot of the sleeping pallet. The heat lasts longer than you might expect, especially if the stones are chosen carefully for their density. We do that, your eldest daughter noted, on the coldest nights. Yes, you confirmed. Many of these practices have become so integrated into our daily life that we don't even think of them as survival strategies anymore. They're simply what we do to get through winter. This observation prompted your middle child to begin identifying other tricks the family employed routinely, wearing multiple thin layers rather than one thick garment, allowing for better adjustment to changing temperatures, eating the day's largest meal in the evenings so that digestion's internal heat coincided with the coldest hours, arranging the dwelling's contents to create windbreaks that directed drafts away from sleeping areas. As he cataloged these practices, you realized how many had indeed become unconscious habits, adaptations so thoroughly incorporated into daily life that they no longer registered as deliberate strategies. This recognition carried both pride in accumulated wisdom and humility, before the knowledge that countless generations had contributed to these techniques through trial, error, and occasional inspiration. The conversation continued, shifting from historical accounts to current practices, from emergency measures to daily adaptations. Each family member contributed observations or questions, the exchange serving multiple purposes: education for the younger children, reinforcement for the older ones, and for all of you, a welcome distraction from the persistent challenges of late winter confinement. Outside, the snow continued falling, adding another layer to the substantial accumulation already surrounding your dwelling. Inside, the fire needed replenishment, prompting your spouse to carefully select the next piece of precious fuel from the dwindling pile near the hearth. The addition of new wood temporarily dimmed the flames as moisture hissed and steam from the not fully seasoned log. This momentary reduction in light and heat, drew your family closer together. An unconscious adjustment to changing conditions that itself represented another survival adaptation. There's one more trick, you said quietly. As the flames began to strengthen again, illuminating the circle of faces turned attentively toward you. Perhaps the most important one, though it doesn't involve specific techniques or materials. What is it? Well, your youngest asked, voice edged with sleepy curiosity. The understanding that winter never lasts forever, you answered, gaze moving from one family member to another, acknowledging each in turn. The certainty, even in the deepest cold or the leanest times, that change will come. That endurance has purpose because spring follows winter as reliably as night follows day. This perspective, this framing of survival as temporary requirement, rather than permanent condition, represented another layer of accumulated wisdom. The psychological aspects of endurance could prove as crucial as physical techniques, particularly during the final weeks of winter, when resources reached their lowest ebb and the emotional toll of extended deprivation weighed most heavily. My mother used to say, your spouse added, setting aside the mended shoe, that winter is a time of waiting, but not passive waiting. Active waiting, preparing, preserving, adapting. Doing what needs to be done each day to ensure you're still there when the waiting ends. The children considered this concept, their expressions reflecting varying levels of comprehension based on age and experience. Your eldest, who had lived through enough winter cycles to understand the pattern completely, nodded agreement. Your middle child looked thoughtful but not entirely convinced, his more restless nature struggling with the notion of patience as active strategy. Your youngest, still weakened by recent illness, but improving daily, simply absorbed the conversation as children do, filing away concepts beyond current understanding for future reference, when experience might provide clarity. As evening deepened toward night, the family's conversation gradually quieted, energy conserved as temperature dropped despite the fire's efforts. The evening meal, thin soup enhanced by the last remnants of the rabbit caught days earlier, accompanied by small portions of bark bread. After eating, preparations for night began with the practiced efficiency of routine, banking the fire to last as long as possible while minimizing fuel consumption, arranging sleeping positions to maximize shared warmth, checking that water had been brought inside where it wouldn't freeze, overnight, ensuring that morning kindling was prepared and ready for the first awakener's use. These activities, this choreography of survival developed through countless winters, proceeded with minimal discussion, each family member understanding their role in the collective effort to endure until morning. When all was prepared, you settled onto the shared sleeping pallet, positioned as usual with the youngest in the protected center space, the eldest near the colder wall where her more developed resistance could better handle the challenge. You and your spouse on either end serving as additional insulation for the children between. As sleep approached, your mind reviewed the day's conversation about survival tricks. Both the dramatic emergency measures preserved through generational storytelling and the mundane daily practices so integrated into routine, they'd become nearly invisible. Together they formed a comprehensive strategy for navigating winter's challenges, a strategy refined through centuries of human experience with scarcity and cold. Some aspects of this strategy involve technical knowledge. How to preserve food beyond its natural lifespan. How to extract maximum heat from minimal fuel. How to protect vulnerable body extremities from frostbite. How to recognize and treat winter illnesses before they became life-threatening. Other aspects address psychological challenges. How to maintain hope during extended deprivation. How to find meaning in survival itself. How to balance individual needs against collective welfare when resources couldn't satisfy all requirements. Together, these physical and psychological adaptations created a framework for endurance, not merely surviving in the most basic biological sense, but persisting with dignity and purpose through circumstances that constantly threaten to overwhelm body and spirit alike. This framework, passed down through generations and continually refined through lived experience, represented one of humanity's most significant achievements. Though it rarely received recognition as such, sleep came gradually, your body surrendering to exhaustion while your mind continued processing these reflections. Dreams, when they arrived, contained fragments of the day's conversations, carrots impossibly preserved beneath frozen ground, shoes lined with golden straw that radiated warmth, blood transformed into sustenance through ancient alchemy. These images, bizarre in isolation but logical within winter's demanding context, illustrated how survival itself required a certain creative vision, the ability to see potential resources where others might see only scarcity. Morning arrived with a changed landscape outside. The snow had stopped falling sometime during the night, leaving a pristine white surface stretching from your dwelling to the distant tree line. Inside, temperature had fallen to its nightly low, breath visible in the dim light filtering through the oiled parchment window covering. As eldest waker this morning, you moved quietly from the sleeping pallet to the hearth, where banked embers still held promising heat beneath their ashy covering. With practiced movements, you exposed these embers carefully, feeding them the prepared kindling that would transform latent heat into active flame. This daily resurrection of fire, this perpetual renewal of the household's central energy source, represented another survival ritual so fundamental it transcended conscious technique. The flames caught, strengthened, and began to push back against night's lingering chill. Around you, your family continued sleeping, conserving energy until warmth made activity more sustainable. This too represented adaptive strategy, adjusting activity levels to match available energy resources, whether those resources took the form of food, warmth, or daylight. As you prepared the morning's first meal, a simple porridge of ground bark extended with the last handful of dried peas, simmered with melted snow, and a pinch of precious salt, you reflected on how the previous day's conversation about survival tricks had clarified something often left unspoken. That living through winter represented not merely endurance but achievement. Each morning that found your family alive, each day navigated without serious injury or illness, each night survived without surrender to cold's insidious invitation to eternal sleep. These constituted victories worth acknowledging, even celebrating in modest ways. The porridge simmering, you moved to the dwelling's small window, wiping condensation from the oiled parchment to peer outside. The snow-covered landscape gleamed in early morning light, beautiful in its severity, treacherous in its beauty. But something caught your attention. A subtle change in quality of light, a marginally different angle of illumination compared to previous weeks. The sun was returning, not obviously, not dramatically, but measurably. Its path across the winter sky had begun its gradual shift, climbing incrementally higher, remaining visible slightly longer. This change, imperceptible on a day-to-day basis, but definite when compared across weeks, signaled the approaching end of winter's deepest phase. You wouldn't mention this observation to the children yet. Hope required careful management in winter's closing weeks, when bodies were most depleted and spirits most vulnerable to disappointment. But you noted it yourself, filing away this evidence of seasonal progression as personal encouragement during the challenging days still to come. Your family woke gradually as aroma from the simmering porridge filled the dwelling. First, your spouse experienced enough to wake when food preparation sounds indicated breakfast approached readiness. Then your eldest daughter, her sense of responsibility bringing her to consciousness when household activity commenced. The younger children followed, your middle child waking suddenly and completely, as was his nature, your youngest stirring more slowly, still regaining strength after illness. Breakfast was consumed with the deliberate appreciation that scarcity teaches. Each spoonful of the simple porridge represented both immediate nourishment and evidence of successful resource management. You had ensured that food remained available even in winter's final challenging weeks. The meal's modest nature meant it couldn't fully satisfy hunger. Rather, it acknowledged hunger while providing enough sustenance to enable the day's necessary activities. After eating, the day's tasks were distributed according to strength and skill. Your spouse would check snares set days earlier before gathering what firewood could be found beneath the new snow. Your eldest daughter would accompany the middle child to collect snow for melting, favoring the cleanest top layer for drinking water. You would remain with your recovering youngest, continuing the indoor work of stretching resources through careful management, mending clothing, preparing preserved foods in ways that maximize perceived volume, maintaining the dwelling's defenses against infiltrating cold. As family members departed for their assigned tasks, bundled in whatever layers could be spared from bedding, you settled into the day's indoor routine, youngest child at your side. Together, you sorted through the remaining dried herbs hanging from roof beams, combining similar varieties to create space while evaluating which might be used immediately, and which must be preserved for potential medicinal needs. Will we have a garden again when the snow melts? Will your youngest ask, small fingers carefully separating dried mint leaves from their stems. Yes, you confirmed. The question itself encouraging evidence that the child could conceptualize future beyond immediate circumstances. A bigger one than last year, I think. The Lord has granted our family an additional strip beside the existing plot, since our household now includes another working member, your eldest daughter, having reached 12 years, now counted as partial adult labor for manor work obligations. Can I have a small corner for flowers? Eom came the next question, revealing how even children shaped by winter's pragmatism still harbored capacity for appreciation beyond mere survival. You considered this request, balancing practical considerations against psychological ones. Flowers consumed space that could grow edibles, yet their presence provided something less tangible but equally necessary: beauty, color, reminder that life encompassed more than mere persistence. A small corner, you agreed. Very small. But yes, there will be space for flowers. This concession, this acknowledgement that survival alone wasn't life's sole purpose, represented another adaptation, another trick that enabled endurance. The cultivation of joy, however modest, created reserves of resilience that physical resources alone couldn't provide. Your conversation continued in this vein, discussing plans for spring planting while completing the herb sorting task. These future-oriented discussions served practical planning purposes while simultaneously providing psychological nourishment, reminders that current deprivation would eventually end, that seasonal cycles could be trusted despite their temporary harshness. Midday brought your spouse back to the dwelling, arms laden with a modest bundle of firewood salvaged from beneath snow-covered deadfall. The haul was smaller than hoped, but larger than feared. Another example of winter's tendency to deliver outcomes somewhere between worst and best expectations. The snares were empty, they reported, carefully arranging the gathered wood near the hearth where moisture could evaporate without dampening the active fire. But I found tracks suggesting rabbits have returned to the bramble thicket. I've reset the snares in that area. This information, this evidence-based adjustment of strategy, illustrated another survival trick's the constant reassessment of methods based on observed conditions. Flexibility, the willingness to abandon unproductive approaches in favor of promising alternatives, often mark the difference between those who endured winter successfully and those who didn't. Your eldest children returned shortly afterward, bringing clean snow for melting and news from their brief expedition. The charcoal burner's son says there's talk of early lambing at the manor farm. Your daughter reported 2 ewes delivered yesterday, earlier than expected. This information, while not immediately applicable to your family's circumstances, contributed to the collective understanding of seasonal progression. Early lambing might indicate changing conditions detectable by animals before humans recognize the shift. It might suggest spring would arrive sooner than conservative estimates predicted. It wouldn't alter your resource management immediately. Winter's lessons about caution remained valid until definite warming occurred, but it provided context for planning. The remainder of the day passed in necessary activities: melting snow for cooking and minimal washing, repairing a section of thatch where melting snow had created a minor leak, preparing the evening meal from carefully measured stores. Throughout these tasks, conversation returned periodically to the previous day's discussion of survival tricks, with family members identifying additional techniques employed by ancestors or neighbors. Old Willem puts pine boughs on his floor. Your middle child contributed, referencing the elderly neighbor whose solitary habits made him a figure of both concern and admiration within the community. Said the needles release something into the air that fights lung sickness. You nodded, familiar with this practice. Pine, fir, spruce, any of the evergreens help with breathing during winter. The wise woman recommends them especially for households with very young children or elders. Could we try that? Your youngest asked. Experience with recent illness making this technique particularly relevant. We could, you agreed. Tomorrow perhaps, when your brother goes to check the lower snare line that passes nearest the pine grove, these small adjustments, these ongoing refinements to survival strategy based on shared knowledge and specific needs, illustrated how winter endurance represented not static resistance but dynamic adaptation. Each family, each household developed their particular combination of techniques, suited to their unique circumstances, within the broader framework of community wisdom. Evening arrived with its customary reduction in activity, as darkness limited productive work and dropping temperatures encouraged energy conservation. The family gathered around the hearth, positioned to benefit from the fire's modest heat while minimizing fuel consumption. Another unconscious adaptation so integrated into routine, it barely registered as intentional strategy. The evening meal, thin stew made from melted snow, dried mushrooms saved from autumn gathering, the last sprouting onion from storage, and a precious handful of dried meat shreds, rationed from the rabbit caught days earlier, provided modest nutrition enhanced by the communal experience of sharing. Conversation flowed more freely than earlier in the day, the completion of necessary tasks allowing mental space for exchanges beyond practical coordination. "I had a thought today," your spouse offered as the meal concluded and wooden bowls were wiped clean with small pieces of bark bread, maximizing every available calorie. "About the survival tricks we discussed. It occurred to me that perhaps the most important one isn't any specific technique, but the passing of knowledge itself." This observation drew the family's attention, even the youngest sensing its significance despite limited life experience. Your spouse continued, developing the insight with careful consideration. "Think about it. Each trick, each method we know came from someone before us. Someone who discovered, whether by accident or desperate inspiration, that a particular approach worked when others failed. And instead of keeping this knowledge to themselves, they shared it. They ensured others would benefit from their discovery." You nodded, understanding immediately the direction of this thought. The sharing itself becomes survival strategy, not just for individuals or single families, but for entire communities across generations. "But exactly," your spouse confirmed. "We survive not just through what we personally know or discover, but through the accumulated wisdom of countless others who faced similar challenges before us." This perspective, this recognition of knowledge transmission as fundamental survival mechanism, shifted the conversation toward deeper appreciation of community bonds. Your family might occupy a single dwelling, might function as primary support unit, but your survival depended on connection to broader networks of shared experience and practical wisdom. The evening progressed toward night with this theme weaving through continuing exchanges. Stories emerged of neighboring families who had developed particular specialties within the community knowledge base. The miller's household with their detailed understanding of grain preservation techniques. The blacksmith's family with their expertise in tool maintenance that extended useful lifespans. The wise woman with her comprehensive knowledge of medicinal plants and healing practices. Each contributed to collective survival. Each shared expertise that strengthened community resilience against winter's multifaceted challenges. This interdependence, this recognition that individual survival ultimately depended on community knowledge and resource sharing, represented perhaps the most significant trick of all. Though one so fundamental, it rarely received explicit acknowledgement. As night deepened and preparation for sleep began, your family moved through the familiar routines with renewed appreciation for their significance. Banking the fire, arranging sleeping positions, securing food stores against nocturnal rodents. Each action represented not merely habit but participation in traditions developed through generations of winter survivors who had refined these practices through lived experience. "Tomorrow," your spouse said quietly, as the family settled onto the shared sleeping pallet, "I'm going to visit old Willem, make sure he has enough firewood. He knows things about weather prediction that could help us prepare for whatever comes next." This planned outreach, this investment in community connection despite limited energy resources, demonstrated practical application of the day's realizations about interdependence. Old Willem's isolation made him vulnerable, but his knowledge remained valuable to the broader community. Ensuring his survival through the final weeks of winter served both compassionate and practical purposes. Sleep came more easily than some nights. The combination of physical activity, modest nourishment, and psychological satisfaction from meaningful conversation creating conditions conducive to rest. Dreams, when they arrived, contained fragments of discussed survival tricks, transformed by unconscious processing into innovative combinations, gardens growing beneath snow, shoes that produced their own warmth, knowledge taking physical form as protection against cold's hungry advance. Morning arrived with subtle but definite change in atmosphere. The temperature, while still certainly below freezing, lacked the profound chill that had characterized recent weeks. The quality of light filtering through the window covering suggested clearer skies rather than the perpetual gray overcast that had dominated for so long. Your spouse, first to wake this morning, moved to the window and wiped condensation from the oiled parchment to peer outside. Their quiet exclamation of surprise drew you from sleep's lingering embrace to join them at this observation point. Outside, the snow-covered landscape gleamed in early morning sunshine, crystalline and brilliant. But what had prompted your spouse's reaction was movement on this previously static scene, a small brown bird hopping across the pristine surface, leaving delicate tracks that betrayed its search for anything edible. The recent snowfall might have exposed. A thrush, your spouse identified softly. "First I've seen since autumn. This appearance, This return of wildlife other than the hardiest winter residents represented significant indication of seasonal shift. Birds possess sensitivity to changing conditions that often preceded human awareness, their migrations and behavioral changes providing reliable indicators of weather patterns to those who paid attention. The thrush's presence didn't signal immediate end to winter's challenges. Weeks of cold and scarcity likely remained before genuine spring arrived with its transformative abundance. But this small creature, its very survival through the harshest season representing its own success story, offered tangible evidence that change had begun its incremental progression. You watched together as the bird continued its careful search across the snow surface, its movements displaying the same deliberate energy conservation that characterized your family's winter adaptations. After several minutes, it disappeared around the dwelling's corner, continuing its solitary journey through the white landscape. Should we tell the children? You asked quietly, aware that hope required careful management when substantial challenges remained ahead. Your spouse considered briefly before responding. Yes, but framed appropriately. Not as promise that hardship has ended, but as reminder that the world remains in motion even when it appears frozen in place. This approach, this careful balance between encouraging hope and maintaining realistic expectations, represented another survival strategy, another trick that enabled endurance through winter's final challenging phase when bodies were most depleted and spirits most vulnerable to disappointment. The day proceeded with its necessary tasks, but subtle shifts in atmosphere accompanied routine activities. The thrush sighting was shared as planned, presented not as definitive seasonal turning point, but as noteworthy observation within ongoing weather patterns. The children received this information, with varying responses reflecting their different temperaments. Your eldest with measured optimism, tempered by practical experience of winter's variable progression. Your middle child with barely contained excitement at any evidence of changing circumstances. Your youngest with simple acceptance, still focused primarily on recovery from recent illness. Other small but significant changes accumulated as the day advanced. The icicles hanging from the roof edge developed water droplets at their tips where previously they had remained solidly frozen throughout daylight hours. The snow covering the path to the communal well showed slight depression where foot traffic had packed it down, evidence of marginally warmer temperatures, allowing minimal compression rather than maintaining the powdery consistency characteristic of deepest cold. None of these changes signaled immediate revolutionary shift in circumstances. The family's survival still depended on careful resource management, still required application of accumulated knowledge about stretching limited supplies through lean periods. But these subtle indicators provided psychological nourishment, as valuable as any physical sustenance, evidence that current deprivation remained temporary rather than permanent, that natural cycles continued their progression despite appearances of frozen stasis. Your spouse departed after the morning meal to check recently repositioned snares and visit elderly Willem as planned. Your eldest daughter took the middle child to collect pine boughs following yesterday's discussion about their benefits for indoor air quality. You remain with your recovering youngest, continuing indoor tasks while monitoring the child's improving, but still vulnerable condition. As you work together sorting through fabric scraps that might be repurposed for necessary repairs, your youngest asked a question that revealed how deeply the previous day's conversations about survival tricks had penetrated even the youngest consciousness. What's our family special trick? The miller knows about grain, the blacksmith about tools. What do we know that helps everyone? The question gave you pause, requiring consideration of your family's particular contribution to community knowledge. After reflection, you offered a response that acknowledged both specificities and broader context. Our family has always been skilled at food preservation. You explained, referencing techniques passed down through your maternal lineage, knowing which plants can be dried effectively, which require fermentation, which benefit from smoking or salt curing. Your grandmother could take almost any edible plant or animal product and transform it to last through winter. The child considered this expression suggesting both pride and family specialty and disappointment that the identified skills seemed less dramatic than some alternatives. That doesn't sound as exciting as the blacksmith making tools from metal. You smiled slightly at this assessment while continuing to sort fabric scraps by potential usefulness. Perhaps not as immediately impressive, you acknowledged. But consider this, tools can be repaired if damaged or even function adequately with minor flaws. Food that spoils in storage cannot be reclaimed. It represents complete loss of the energy invested in growing, harvesting, and processing it. This perspective, This framing of food preservation as fundamental rather than peripheral skill caused reconsideration visible in your child's expression before further discussion could develop. However, an unexpected sound interrupted the conversation. 3 distinct knocks on the dwelling's door. Visitors were uncommon in winter's depth, particularly during daylight hours when most households focused on essential tasks requiring limited precious energy. The formal announcement represented by knocking rather than simply calling out while entering, as closer neighbors might do, suggested someone less familiar seeking access. Setting aside the sorting project, you moved to the door, opening it cautiously to minimize cold air infiltration while assessing the visitor. Outside stood a young man of perhaps 16 winters, dressed in the distinctive garb of the manor house servants, his breath forming clouds in the still cold air despite the marginally improved temperature. "The steward sends word," he announced with the formal diction of someone delivering an official message. "Distribution of emergency stores from the manor granary will occur tomorrow at midday. Each household should send 1 adult representative capable of carrying their allotment." This announcement, this indication that the Lord's household had assessed conditions and determined intervention necessary, carried significant implications. Such distributions, while theoretically regular occurrences during winter, happened in practice only when circumstances warranted special attention. The decision suggested official recognition that many village households approached dangerous resource depletion as winter extended toward its conclusion. "The household acknowledges the message." You responded with equal formality, using the traditional phrasing that confirmed receipt of official communication. "1 adult will attend at the appointed time." The young messenger nodded, his duty discharged, and turned to continue his circuit of outlying dwellings. You closed the door quickly to preserve precious interior warmth, mind already calculating implications of this development. The distribution would almost certainly include grain, rye, or barley, or perhaps a mixture of both. Possibly also dried peas or beans if the manor stores remain sufficient. These staples would extend your family's dwindling resources significantly, potentially eliminating the need for most extreme conservation measures during winter's final weeks. Your youngest, who had observed this exchange with interest, recognized its significance despite limited experience with official manor communications. "Does this mean more food?" they asked directly, child's perception cutting immediately to practical implications. "Yes," you confirmed, returning to the sorting task while mentally adjusting plans based on this new information. "Tomorrow we'll receive additional supplies from the manor stores. Not abundance," you cautioned, managing expectations appropriately, but enough to make the remaining winter weeks less concerning. The child absorbed this information with visible relief, the constant background awareness of scarcity, momentarily lightened by promise of supplementation. This reaction, this immediate psychological benefit from anticipated rather than actual resource increase, illustrated another dimension of winter survival, the importance of hope itself as sustaining force. When your spouse and elder children returned from their respective expeditions, the news of tomorrow's distribution was shared immediately, its significance generating subtle but noticeable shifts in demeanor throughout the family. Your spouse's shoulders, habitually tense with the responsibility of providing during scarcity, relaxed marginally. Your eldest daughter's expression revealed cautious relief tempered by experience that taught the value of measured expectations. Your middle child displayed the most visible reaction, his natural exuberance temporarily overriding winter's accumulated restraint. "Will there be wheat flour?" he asked, hope elevating his voice to a higher pitch than usual. "Or just rye?" "Most likely rye," your spouse answered, tempering expectations with practical knowledge. "Wheat is reserved primarily for the manor household and for spring planting. But rye flour makes good bread, especially compared to our recent fare." This reference to the bark bread that had sustained the family through recent weeks needed no elaboration. All had experienced its bitter aftertaste, its minimal satisfaction compared to proper grain products, its reluctant acceptance as necessary alternative to nothing at all. Old Willem says the distribution is happening because the steward noted increased weakness among villagers at Sunday service. Your spouse continued, sharing information gleaned during the day's visit to the elderly neighbor. Several people struggled to remain standing through the prayers, and Goodwife Cooper's youngest fainted outright. This explanation, this acknowledgement, that intervention came in response to visible evidence of physical deterioration, rather than benevolent anticipation of need. The Lord's responsibility for preventing outright starvation among those who worked his land stemmed from economic self-interest, as much as moral obligation. Tenants too weak to perform spring planting represented threat to the manor's productivity and thus its prosperity. Willem himself looks poorly. Your spouse added in lower tones, clearly intended for adult ears though, the children undoubtedly heard as well in the dwelling's confined space. I stacked wood for his hearth and shared some of the dried rosemary to ease his breathing. He offered weather wisdom in exchange, says the thrush's early return and the particular pattern of icicle melt suggests we'll have an early, wet spring this year. This exchange of resources that address both physical and knowledge needs, illustrated yet again how interdependence functioned as fundamental survival strategy. Your family sacrificed a small amount of precious fuel and medicinal herbs. In return, they gained forecasting insights that might prove valuable for planning planting strategies and early foraging expeditions. The day proceeded with necessary tasks, but the atmosphere had changed subtly, lightened by anticipation of tomorrow's distribution. The pine boughs collected by your elder children were arranged along the dwelling's perimeter, their resinous scent immediately improving the interior air quality, while their deep green color provided welcome visual relief from winter's monochromatic palette. The fire burned with careful moderation, neither too consumptive nor too meager, maintaining the delicate balance between resource conservation and immediate comfort. Evening arrived with its customary routines, the preparation of the day's primary meal, the strategic positioning around the hearth to maximize benefit from limited heat, the conversation that served both practical and psychological purposes. Tonight's discussion centered primarily on plans for utilizing the anticipated distribution, how much should be consumed immediately to address current depletion, how much preserved for the remaining winter weeks, what forms of preparation would maximize both nutrition and satisfaction. We should make proper bread right away, your middle child advocated, his perpetual hunger making this preference unsurprising, with caraway seeds from the storage pouch.
Some for bread, yes. Your spouse agreed, acknowledging this legitimate desire while maintaining the adult perspective on resource management. But we'll need to preserve the majority for gradual use. Remember that even with tomorrow's distribution, we must stretch supplies until fresh growth becomes available. This reminder, this emphasis on continued conservation despite temporary abundance, reflected the hard-earned wisdom that shaped winter survival. The temptation to celebrate improved circumstances through immediate consumption could create dangerous vulnerability in later weeks if weather conditions delayed spring's arrival or early plantings failed to thrive. The evening meal, thin soup enhanced by pine needle tea for vitamin content, accompanied by the last of the bark bread, was consumed with the particular appreciation that anticipated improvement often brings to present scarcity. Each family member ate slowly, attentively, extracting maximum satisfaction from minimal provisions, while imagination supplied vivid anticipation of tomorrow's potential additions. Night brought the usual preparations, banking the fire for maximum conservation during sleeping hours, arranging the shared pallet for optimal warmth distribution, securing the dwelling against nocturnal heat loss through any avenue that might be addressed. These routines, performed with the efficiency of long practice, represented another layer of survival knowledge, the recognition that sleep itself required protection through proper preparation, that rest quality directly affected next-day functioning in challenging circumstances. Morning arrived with clear skies and notably warmer temperatures, still below freezing, but lacking winter's deepest bite. The sun, rising marginally earlier than previous weeks, cast longer light through the window covering, illuminating the dwelling's interior with greater penetration than had been possible during the darkest period. This natural progression, this gradual but definite shift towards spring's increased daylight, provided another psychological boost, independent of the anticipated distribution. After the morning meal, porridge extended with pine nuts, your eldest daughter had discovered in a previously overlooked corner of the storage area, preparations began for attending the manor distribution. Your spouse, as strongest family member, most capable of carrying significant weight over distance, would represent the household at midday. This meant adjusting the day's task allocation to accommodate their absence during prime working hours. "I'll check the snare line on my return journey," they planned, organizing the day for maximum efficiency. That way a single trip serves multiple purposes. This approach, this careful attention to energy conservation through combined activities, represented another survival trick so integrated into daily functioning that it barely registered as intentional strategy. Winter demanded such efficiency. Those who survived its challenges developed this mindfulness as instinctive practice rather than conscious choice. Your spouse departed shortly before midday, carrying an empty sack for transporting whatever the distribution might provide. The remaining family members continued indoor tasks appropriate to their ages and strengths, your eldest daughter teaching the younger children techniques for weaving straw into small, useful household items. You yourself carefully reassessing the dwelling's thatch for areas requiring repair when milder weather permitted proper attention. Time passed with the inconsistent pace characteristic of anticipation. Activities that normally absorbed attention completely now served primarily as distraction from awareness of passing moments. Conversation frequently returned to speculation about exactly what and how much the distribution might provide, despite attempts to maintain realistic expectations. The last time, 2 winters ago, each household received a measure of rye and a handful of dried peas. Your eldest daughter recalled, her memory of previous distributions more complete than her younger siblings. But that winter wasn't as long or as cold as this one has been. This observation, this recognition that circumstances might justify more generous allocation than previous experiences, balanced hope against excessive expectation. The manor's stores, while more substantial than any individual households, remained finite and subject to careful management that considered future needs alongside present demands. When the dwelling's door finally opened to readmit your spouse, the entire family's attention focused immediately on their burden, a sack clearly containing significant weight, carried with the careful movements of someone transporting precious cargo. Their expression as they entered conveyed positive news before any verbal report could be offered. "The steward was generous today," they announced, carefully lowering the sack to the floor near the hearth. Each household received a full measure of mixed grain, mostly rye, but some barley as well, and half a measure of dried peas. And something unexpected, salt fish already preserved from the manor's special stores. This report, this confirmation of resources, even beyond reasonable expectation, generated visible reactions throughout the family. Your eldest daughter's practical nature immediately began calculating how these additions would extend existing supplies through winter's remainder. Your middle child focused on immediate possibilities, particularly the promised bread that would replace bark-based alternatives. Your youngest simply absorbed the general atmosphere of relief and anticipation, still young enough that the full implications of resource scarcity remained partially abstract. The distribution's contents were carefully unpacked, each component assessed with the particular attention that scarcity teaches. The grain sea, indeed a mixture of rye and barley, with the occasional wheat kernel visible amongst its darker companions, filled a substantial portion of the family's largest wooden bowl. The dried peas, hard as pebbles, but containing concentrated nutrition that had sustained countless generations through winter, formed a modest mound in a smaller container. The salt fish, 6 small herring preserved through smoking and salting, represented protein so long absent from regular meals that its distinctive aroma seemed almost unreal in the dwelling's familiar atmosphere. The steward said the Lord ordered distribution now, rather than waiting until traditional early spring allocation. Your spouse reported, providing context that illuminated manner decision-making. Apparently word reached him that other villages have experienced losses this winter. Not just the elderly and infirm, but working-age tenants as well. He recognizes that weakened survivors can't properly prepare and plant spring fields. This explanation, this frank acknowledgement of the economic calculation underlying apparent generosity, carried no surprise for adult family members. The relationship between lord and tenant operated according to practical considerations that had defined rural existence for generations. That self-interest rather than pure compassion motivated the distribution, diminished neither its value nor its welcome reception. The family's immediate priority became appropriate storage of these unexpected resources. The grain transferred to the elevated wooden box, where its predecessors had been kept, protected from moisture and rodents, by design features developed through generations of similar necessity. The dried peas joined their limited remaining companions in a tightly lidded ceramic container. The precious salt fish were hung from a ceiling beam, high enough to discourage vermin, but accessible for cooking when needed. With storage addressed, discussion turned to immediate utilization. Unanimous agreement supported allocating a portion of grain for immediate bread making. Your spouse took responsibility for grinding this selection, using the hand quern that transformed whole grains into coarse flour through circular motion, requiring significant upper body strength. Your eldest daughter prepared the soaking liquid that would begin the leavening process, combining water with a small amount of sour starter, preserved from the last bread-making episode months earlier. The afternoon assumed an almost celebratory quality, the anticipated bread-creating atmosphere, unlike ordinary days, when survival activities proceeded without specific culmination. The dwelling filled with the particular sounds of food preparation, the rhythmic scraping of the quern stone as it ground grain into flour, the wooden spoon striking bowl sides as soaking liquid combined with ground meal, the low murmur of conversation focused on positive possibilities rather than necessary limitations. Should we use caraway seeds? Your middle child asked again, persistent in this desire for flavor enhancement that had become something of a personal campaign. Yes, you decided, the distribution's unexpected generosity justifying this small luxury. A pinch only, but yes, this concession, this acknowledgement that celebration required some departure from strictest conservation, reflected another survival trick, rarely articulated, but universally practiced among those who successfully navigated winter's challenges, the recognition that psychological nourishment, through occasional indulgence, preserved the will to endure continued hardship. As daylight began its early winter retreat, the bread dough had been prepared, kneaded to proper consistency, and set near the fire to rise slowly in the cool dwelling. Its distinctive aroma, the promise of proper baking yet to come, filled the small space with olfactory reminder that circumstances had genuinely improved. This sensory reassurance, as much as the anticipated physical sustenance, contributed to the family's elevated mood. The evening meal featured the first allocation from the distribution, a portion of dried peas soaked and simmered with one of the salt herring, creating broth more substantial than anything the family had consumed in weeks. This simple combination, protein and legumes, in hot liquid, satisfied nutritional needs, long left unaddressed by the predominantly carbohydrate-based emergency diet that had sustained minimal functioning during the leanest period. It tastes like feast day, your youngest observed, carefully consuming each spoonful with the deliberate appreciation that scarcity teaches. Not quite feast day, your spouse corrected gently, managing expectations while acknowledging improvement, but certainly better than recent fare. This balance, this recognition of relative rather than absolute abundance, characterized the family's approach to unexpected resources. Gratitude for improvement coexisted with continued awareness that challenges remained, that winter had not yet released its grip, despite showing signs of gradual retreat. After the evening meal, while the bread dough continued its slow rise, conversation returned to the catalogue of survival tricks that had occupied recent discussions. Tonight's focus shifted from emergency techniques toward transitional strategies, the particular knowledge required to navigate winter's end and early spring's unpredictable offerings. The first greens will appear before the snow fully melts, your spouse noted, sharing knowledge passed through generations of careful observation. Dandelion and nettle emerge while nights remain cold, but their tender first growth provides exactly what bodies need after winter depletion. You added context from your own family tradition. My grandmother taught that these first green plants should be harvested sparingly, taking only every third plant encountered, leaving the rest to establish properly. This ensures continued growth throughout the season. This guidance, this emphasis on sustainable harvesting, even during times of greatest need, reflected the deep ecological understanding embedded within traditional knowledge systems. Short-term satisfaction through over-harvesting created longer-term vulnerability. Restraint, even when difficult, preserved future resources that ultimately provided greater total nourishment. Your eldest daughter, absorbing this information with the seriousness of someone anticipating future responsibility, posed a practical question: how do you distinguish the safe early greens from similar-looking plants that might cause harm? This query needs this recognition that foraging required specific identification skills rather than general knowledge, prompted detailed discussion of visual characteristics, growth patterns, and habitat preferences that distinguished edible early spring plants from potentially harmful lookalikes. The conversation represented another knowledge transmission session, another investment in survival skills that would extend beyond current family members to future generations. While adults focused on this educational exchange, your younger children engaged in their own form of winter adaptation, an imaginative game involving small carved wooden figures that enacted elaborate scenarios of springtime abundance. Their play, conducted in lowered voices that acknowledged ongoing adult discussion, demonstrated the psychological resilience that allowed even the youngest to navigate between present limitations and anticipated improvement. Evening deepened toward night, the bread dough having risen sufficiently for shaping and baking, this process forming the leavened mixture into a round loaf before placing it directly on the hearthstones. To baking required careful attention to fire management, ensuring sufficient heat for proper cooking without excessive fuel consumption. Your spouse took primary responsibility for this critical task, experience having taught precise assessment of temperature through visual and tactile cues rather than any measuring device. The baking bread filled the dwelling with an aroma so compelling it seemed almost visible, a presence that transformed the atmosphere from mere shelter to something approaching comfort. Each family member responded to this sensory experience according to their nature, your spouse with quiet satisfaction in providing this basic sustenance, your eldest daughter with practical assessment of cooking progress, your middle child with barely contained anticipation of tasting, your youngest with drowsy contentment as sleep approached despite excitement. When the bread finally emerged from its hearthstone baking, golden brown crust gleaming in firelight. It represented more than mere food. This loaf, this tangible evidence of improved circumstances, symbolized the family's successful navigation through winter's darkest phase. Not triumph, for winter had not yet released its grip entirely, but achievement nonetheless. Evidence that the accumulated knowledge, careful resource management, and mutual support that defined your household had proven adequate to the season's challenges. The fresh bread remained untouched that night, set aside to cool properly before morning consumption. This restraint, this ability to delay gratification, even when desire pressed urgently, represented another survival adaptation, another trick that distinguished successful winter endurance from desperate consumption that created future vulnerability. Sleep came easily. Despite anticipation, the day's activities having required significant energy expenditure, even with improved mood. Dreams, when they arrived, contained fragments of recent experiences transformed by unconscious processing, bread that grew like plants from snow-covered ground, fish that spoke wisdom in human voices, grain that multiplied when treated with particular respect. These images, bizarre in isolation, but comprehensible within the context of winter's metaphorical landscape, reflected the mind's attempt to integrate material improvement with psychological processing of scarcity's lingering effects. Morning arrived with unusual sounds penetrating the dwelling's walls, liquid dripping, snow shifting, occasional chunks of ice falling from the roof edge. These acoustical indicators confirmed what visual assessment soon verified. A genuine thaw had begun, temperatures having risen above freezing for the first sustained period since winter's deepest grip had established itself months earlier. This meteorological shift, this atmospheric confirmation of seasonal progression, already suggested by subtle biological indicators, created immediate practical implications. The path to the communal well, packed hard by foot traffic throughout winter, would become treacherously slippery as its surface transitioned between frozen and thawed states. The dwelling's thatch, compressed by months of snow accumulation, would require careful monitoring as meltwater sought paths of least resistance through its layered construction. The ground itself, frozen solid since early winter, would begin its gradual transformation toward the muddy conditions that characterized the transitional period between seasons. But alongside these challenges, genuine opportunities emerged. The thaw meant access to areas previously rendered inaccessible by deep snow accumulation. It meant exposed vegetation that might provide emergency forage for both humans and the community's livestock. It meant increased animal activity as creatures emerged from winter dormancy or returned from seasonal migration, offering potential hunting and trapping prospects beyond the limited options of deepest winter. The morning meal featured the bread baked the previous evening, its texture and flavor representing such dramatic improvement over recent fare that even this simple consumption assumed celebratory qualities. Each family member received a modest slice, the loaf carefully rationed despite distribution-enhanced resources. Alongside this treasured food, a thin porridge provided additional sustenance, its base liquid enhanced with herring broth that added both flavor and nutrition, otherwise absent from winter-restricted diet. "The bread makes my mouth remember," your youngest observed, with characteristic directness, expressing the sensory reconnection that proper food created after extended deprivation. This comment, this recognition that bodies retained memory of normal nourishment even through periods of scarcity, prompted reflection on how winter altered not just external circumstances, but internal expectations. Gradual accommodation to reduced provisions created a shifted baseline, where even modest improvement registered as remarkable abundance. This psychological adaptation, this capacity to recalibrate satisfaction thresholds according to available resources, represented another survival trick, rarely articulated but universally practiced by those who successfully navigated winter's challenges. The day's activities incorporated response to changed weather conditions alongside ongoing survival tasks. Your spouse departed to check snare lines and gather emerging resources that thawing conditions might reveal. Your eldest daughter, accompanied by her younger brother, went to assess the communal well's condition and collect water less laboriously than frozen sources had required. You remained with your recovering youngest, attending to indoor tasks while monitoring the thatch for evidence of leaks that thawing might exacerbate. Throughout these divided activities, awareness of improved circumstances created subtle shifts in approach and attitude to conservation remained necessary. Winter had not yet released its grip entirely, and spring's promises required weeks for fulfillment. But the desperate edge that characterized deepest scarcity had dulled perceptibly. Movements contained marginally more energy, voices slightly more animation, planning somewhat longer time horizons than immediate necessity had previously permitted. Your spouse returned midday with evidence of improved hunting prospects. 2 small birds caught in the snare line where previously nothing had been found for days. These modest prizes, thrushes similar to the one observed earlier, represented protein sources particularly valuable after winter's predominantly carbohydrate-based emergency diet. Their small bodies contained concentrated nutrition that would contribute disproportionately to the family's recovery from extended deprivation. The south-facing slope has patches of exposed ground already, they reported, describing environmental conditions encountered during their expedition. If tomorrow remains warm, the first shoots might appear in protected spots by week's end. This forecast, this evidence-based assessment of imminent natural resources, allowed for adjustment to short-term planning. The birds would provide immediate protein through careful distribution among family members. The anticipated early growth, if it materialized as predicted, would supplement remaining stored provisions with fresh greens containing vitamins absent from winter diet. These additions, combined with the manna distribution, created genuine confidence that the family would successfully navigate the transitional period between winter's end and spring's proper establishment. Your eldest children returned from the well with reports that confirmed community-wide awareness of changing circumstances. Other families had been observed engaging in activities possible only during thawing conditions, clearing drainage channels to direct meltwater away from dwellings, exposing garden plots where soil might begin warming earlier than surrounding areas, retrieving items deliberately frozen into storage during autumn for preservation purposes. The wise woman was at the well, your daughter reported. He said this thaw appears lasting rather than temporary based on the particular color of sky and behavior of returning birds. She's already gathering pussy willow buds for her early spring remedies. This assessment from a respected knowledge keeper, someone whose lifetime of observation had developed pattern recognition beyond ordinary awareness, provided additional confidence that seasonal transition had genuinely begun rather than representing temporary fluctuation. The wise woman's commencement of spring gathering activities signaled broader recognition that winter's grip, while not fully released, had weakened beyond recovery. The afternoon progressed with energy distributed between immediate needs and forward-looking preparations. The birds caught that morning were carefully prepared for cooking, their small bodies yielding minimal meat but valuable organs that contained concentrated nutrients, particularly beneficial for those recovering from winter depletion. Feathers were preserved for future use in pillows or insulation projects. Even the delicate bones would be utilized, simmered for broth after meat consumption, extracted primary nourishment. This comprehensive usage mitigates this absolute minimization of waste that characterized traditional processing, represented another survival trick embedded so deeply in practice, it barely registered as intentional strategy. Resources limited by seasonal scarcity required complete utilization. Those who survived winter's challenges developed this thoroughness as instinctive approach rather than conscious choice. As evening approached, the dwelling's atmosphere reflected the cumulative impact of recent improvements, the manna distribution providing substantial resource extension, the thawing conditions offering environmental indication of seasonal progression, the successful hunting yielding modest but significant protein supplementation. These factors combined created genuine optimism regarding the family's prospects for successful navigation through winter's remaining challenges. The evening meal featured the day's hunting success, small portions of thrush meat for each family member, accompanied by broth, enhanced with dried herbs, and a slice of precious bread. This combination, protein, salt, and complex carbohydrates, unavailable during deepest scarcity, EHS nutritional needs, long neglected by emergency diet, bodies depleted by months of inadequate nourishment, responded with almost immediate energy enhancement, visible in improved color and more animated conversation around the hearth. "I feel stronger already," your middle child declared with characteristic directness, flexing small arms to demonstrate perceived improvement. "The body responds quickly to certain nutrients," you explained, balancing enthusiasm with realistic understanding of recovery timelines. "But complete restoration takes longer than a single meal. We'll continue improving gradually as our diet expands with spring's offerings." This perspective, this recognition that recovery followed patterns similar to decline, with gradual progression rather than immediate transformation, reflected the measured approach to both hardship and improvement that characterized successful winter navigation. Expectations managed too optimistically created vulnerability to disappointment. Those calibrated to realistic timelines supported sustained adaptation through changing circumstances. Evening conversation centered increasingly on forward-looking plans rather than immediate survival concerns. Discussion of which garden areas should receive earliest attention once planting became possible, which wild resources would appear, in which sequence as spring advanced, which household repairs deserved priority once temperatures allowed proper outdoor work. These topics reflected psychological transition from winter's constrained focus to spring's expanding possibilities. "We should check the beehives early," your spouse suggested, thinking ahead to this crucial food and medicine source. Last year's late frost damaged many colonies in the village. Early intervention might prevent similar losses. Your eldest daughter, absorbing this planning process as part of her ongoing education in household management, offered her own suggestion. The stream banks should be examined for erosion once ice melts completely. Last spring's flooding weakened several sections near our garden plot. These contributions, these specific action items identified for seasonal transition, demonstrated how winter's challenges fostered not passive endurance, but active preparation for future opportunity. The family had not merely survived the leanest period, they had maintained capacity for forward planning, despite physical depletion and resource limitation. As night fell completely, bringing clearer skies that ironically created colder conditions through radiational cooling, the family prepared for sleep with the familiar choreography of resource conservation. The fire received careful attention, neither extinguished entirely, nor fed lavishly, but maintained at level appropriate for the night's anticipated temperature. Sleeping positions were arranged according to established pattern, with youngest and most vulnerable placed centrally, where warmth concentration remained highest. Before sleep claimed consciousness completely, your spouse spoke quietly into the dwelling's darkness. "We've made it through again," they observed, voice containing neither triumph nor mere relief, but a deeper recognition of achievement. Not past all danger yet, but through the worst. This assessment, this acknowledgement of partial rather than complete victory, captured Winter's essential lesson that survival represented ongoing process rather than definitive accomplishment, that each day successfully navigated, contributed to, but never concluded the broader project of existence in challenging circumstances. "The tricks worked," your middle child mumbled, already half claimed by sleep, but wanting to participate in this moment of recognition. "Yes," you confirmed softly, "the tricks worked." The knowledge saved and shared, the resources carefully managed, the community supporting its members, all these allowed us to reach this point where spring becomes visible on the horizon. This articulation, this explicit acknowledgement of the multifaceted strategy that enabled survival created space for appropriate appreciation without premature celebration. Winter had not yet released its grip entirely. Challenges remained before genuine abundance returned, but the family had successfully navigated its most dangerous phase, had maintained not merely biological existence, but functional capacity and forward-looking orientation, despite profound resource limitation. Sleep arrived with the particular depth that follows genuine reassurance. Dreams, when they came, contained fragments of anticipated rather than feared futures, gardens displaying early growth, wild plants emerging from thawing soil, community members gathering for shared work projects that combined necessity with social connection. These images, representing reasonable rather than fantastic projections, reflected minds transitioning from winter's defensive posture towards spring's expansive possibilities. Morning arrived with confirmation that weather patterns continued their seasonal shift. The overnight freeze had been less severe than previous weeks, thawing beginning earlier as strengthening sunlight reached the landscape with increasing directness. Bird calls previously absent formed dawn chorus of modest but distinct volume, their variety indicating species return had begun in earnest, rather than representing isolated early arrivals. Your family woke to this emerging soundscape with collective recognition of its significance. Without requiring explicit discussion, each member acknowledged through expression and demeanor that genuine transition had commenced, that winter's domination had passed its peak and begun its inevitable decline toward spring's ascendance. The day began with familiar routines, adapted to changing circumstances. The fire revived with slightly less urgency as temperatures moderated, morning meal prepared with modest enhancement from remaining distribution resources, daily tasks allocated according to weather conditions and individual capabilities. But underlying these activities, a subtle shift had occurred in fundamental orientation, from the defensive posture of pure survival toward the cautiously optimistic stance of anticipated renewal. As your family dispersed to their daily responsibilities, your spouse to check traps and assess emerging wild resources, your elder children to community water collection and perimeter maintenance, you to household management and youngest child supervision, each carried forward the accumulated wisdom that had enabled winter survival. The tricks that let you live, these practical adaptations, psychological adjustments, and community connections, had proven adequate to the season's challenges. Not all families, in all villages, would make this transition successfully. Winter exacted its toll each year, claiming those whose resources, knowledge, or physical reserves proved inadequate to its extended demands. But your household had navigated its darkest period, had maintained not merely existence, but capacity for recovery and renewal. This achievement, while not guaranteed to repeat in future cycles, provided foundation for cautious confidence in accumulated wisdom's continuing relevance. Outside your dwelling, snow continued its gradual retreat, exposing soil dormant but not dead, capable of regeneration when conditions permitted. Inside, your family continued its careful management of limited resources while preparing for expanded possibilities. Between these internal and external landscapes, a harmony existed, a synchronization of human adaptation with natural cycling that represented not dominance of environment, but successful integration within it. The tricks that let you live had proven their value once again. The knowledge preserved and transmitted through generations, the community bonds that distributed resources and support, the psychological adaptations that managed expectations without surrendering hope, these elements combined had created pathway through winter's challenges towards spring's renewal. And that was enough. It had always been enough. It would continue being enough as long as knowledge passed forward, adaptation continued developing, and communities recognized their interdependence with each other and the natural systems that ultimately sustained all life through cycling seasons of abundance and scarcity. The fire burned steadily in the hearth, neither extravagant nor inadequate, but appropriate to current needs. Outside, a thrush called to potential mates, its song announcing availability for seasonal reproduction. Inside, your family moved through their day with the quiet confidence of those who had faced substantial challenges and discovered themselves adequate to the task. Winter's grip loosened one finger at a time. Reluctantly but inevitably, spring's presence strengthened, subtly but perceptibly with each passing day. And between these seasonal powers, your family continued its existence, marked by winter's hardships, but not defined by them, anticipating spring's abundance, but not dependent upon its immediate arrival. The tricks that let you live had proven sufficient once again, and that quiet achievement, that modest victory over circumstances that claimed others less fortunate or less prepared, contained dignity worthy of acknowledgement, if not celebration. You had survived. You would plant again, harvest again, prepare again for winter's inevitable return. The cycle would continue, as it always had, carrying forward the knowledge that enabled human endurance through the leanest times towards seasons of relative plenty. And that was enough. It had always been enough. The miracle of endurance, of making it to spring, season after season, generation after generation. The quiet genius of survival.